The Plantagenets, those fierce Angevin lords who wore the crown of England for over 3 centuries, created not just a kingdom, but an entire world of chivalry, lore, and legend that echoes through time to this very day. Our story begins not in England, but in the fertile valleys of Anjou, that beautiful region of western France where vineyards stretch toward distant horizons, and the Loire River wound its way through lands both prosperous and contested. Here, in the early decades of the 12th century, a young count named Geoffrey would earn himself a nickname that would define an entire royal dynasty. Geoffrey of Anjou, handsome and ambitious, had a peculiar habit that set him apart from other nobles of his time. He would wear a sprig of yellow broom flower, known in Latin as Plantagenista, in his cap when he rode to battle or attended court. This simple gesture, this small yellow flower tucked into his helmet, would give birth to the name Plantagenet. Though curiously, the dynasty itself wouldn't officially use this name until centuries after Geoffrey's death. Geoffrey was more than just a count with a fondness for flowers. Born around 1113, he inherited Anjou at a time when the county was rising in power and influence. The Angevins, as the counts of Anjou were known, had spent generations building their power base in western France, carefully manoeuvring between the great powers of the age. They were neither vassals of the French king in any meaningful sense, nor completely independent rulers. Instead, they occupied that fascinating middle ground of medieval politics, where personal relationships, military might, and shrewd diplomacy determine one's place in the hierarchy of power. The young count possessed remarkable qualities that would pass down through generations of his descendants. He was tall for his age, with reddish gold hair that caught the sunlight when he removed his helmet after battle. Contemporary chroniclers described him as learned, unusual for a warrior noble of his time, with a genuine interest in history and literature. He could read Latin, spoke multiple dialects of French, and showed a keen understanding of law and administration that went beyond the simple warrior ethos of many of his contemporaries. But Geoffrey's greatest achievement, the act that would transform his family from regional counts into kings and emperors, came through his marriage to Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England. This union, arranged when Geoffrey was merely 15 and Matilda was 25, seemed unlikely at first. Matilda, proud and imperial in bearing, had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V and still styled herself as Empress despite her husband's death. She looked upon the young Count of Anjou with barely concealed disdain at their first meeting in 1128. The marriage ceremony itself, held in Le Mans Cathedral on a warm June day, was a grand affair that brought together the nobility of England, Normandy, and Anjou. The cathedral, with its soaring arches and stained-glass windows that cast coloured light across the stone floor, witnessed the union that would change English history forever. Matilda wore a gown of deep blue silk, embroidered with golden lions, the symbols of her father's kingdom, while Geoffrey appeared in scarlet and gold, the colours of Anjou, with that characteristic sprig of broom flower prominently displayed. Their early marriage was tempestuous, marked by separations and reconciliations that became the subject of court gossip from London to Paris. Matilda found her young husband impetuous and insufficiently deferential to her imperial status. Geoffrey, in turn, struggled with a wife who had ruled as empress and refused to adopt the submissive role expected of medieval wives. Yet despite their personal conflicts, or perhaps because of the passion that underlay them, they produced 3 sons who would carry the Plantagenet blood forward. Henry, who would become Henry II of England, Geoffrey, who would become Count of Brittany, and William, who would die young. The political landscape into which these children were born was one of unprecedented chaos in English history. When Henry I died in December 1135, supposedly from eating too many lampreys despite his physician's warnings, he left behind a succession crisis that would tear England apart. Henry had designated Matilda as his heir, making the great barons of England swear sacred oaths to support her claim. But a woman had never ruled England in her own right, and many nobles harboured deep reservations about accepting Matilda as their sovereign. Into this vacuum stepped Stephen of Blois, Matilda's cousin, who possessed the crucial advantages of being male, being in England when Henry died, and having the support of his brother Henry of Blois, the powerful Bishop of Winchester. Stephen's seizure of the crown in December 1135 was swift and decisive. He raced to Winchester to secure the royal treasury, then to London, where he was crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury on December 22nd, less than 3 weeks after the old king's death. What followed was a period so devastating to English prosperity and order that contemporary chroniclers called it simply the Anarchy. For nearly 20 years, England would be torn between two claimants to the throne, with barons switching sides based on advantage, castles rising on every hill and promontory, and the common people suffering under the weight of constant warfare and lawlessness. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that ancient record of English history, recorded with unusual emotion that during Stephen's reign, men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. Geoffrey Plantagenet initially seemed more interested in securing Normandy than helping his wife claim England. While Matilda struggled to establish herself in England, Geoffrey methodically conquered the Duchy of Normandy, which had also been part of Henry I's realm. His campaigns in Normandy demonstrated the military genius that would reappear in his descendants. He understood siege warfare with a sophistication that went beyond the simple battering ram and catapult techniques of his contemporaries. At the siege of Montreuil-Bellay, he employed miners to undermine the walls while using calculated psychological warfare against the defenders, spreading rumours of relief forces that would never come and offering generous terms to those who surrendered early. The conquest of Normandy took Geoffrey nearly 10 years, but by 1144 he had secured the entire duchy. He entered Rouen, the capital of Normandy, in triumph, riding through streets lined with citizens who watched in silence as their new duke passed. Geoffrey understood the importance of ceremony and symbolism in medieval politics. He had himself invested as Duke of Normandy in Rouen Cathedral, deliberately echoing the ceremonies of William the Conqueror, reminding all present that he too was now master of both sides of the Channel, at least in terms of territorial control. Meanwhile, Matilda's struggle for the English crown had reached its dramatic peak and equally dramatic collapse. In February 1141, she had achieved what seemed impossible, capturing King Stephen himself at the Battle of Lincoln. For a brief moment, it appeared that the crown was within her grasp. She entered London in triumph, preparing for her coronation as England's first female sovereign. But Matilda's proud and imperious nature, the very qualities that had made her an effective empress, now worked against her. She alienated the citizens of London with heavy tax demands and haughty behaviour, treating them as conquered subjects rather than supporters to be cultivated. The Londoners rose against her, literally chasing her from the city before her coronation could take place. The scene was both dramatic and humiliating. The would-be queen fleeing from Westminster, her dinner still warm on the table as the bells of London rang in rebellion and citizens poured into the streets. She barely escaped with her closest supporters, riding hard for the safety of Oxford, while behind her London welcomed Stephen's queen, Matilda of Boulogne, who had maintained the royalist cause during her husband's captivity. The war continued, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. Stephen was released in exchange for Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother and chief military commander, and the kingdom remained divided. Some regions acknowledged Stephen as king, others held for Matilda, and many simply acknowledged whoever's army was closest at any given moment. Castles sprouted across the landscape like mushrooms after rain, with chroniclers claiming that over 1,000 unauthorized castles were built during the Anarchy, each one a centre of localized tyranny, where robber barons could prey upon merchants and pilgrims with impunity. It was into this chaos that young Henry Plantagenet, son of Geoffrey and Matilda, first ventured to England in 1147. At just 14 years old, he displayed the precocious military ambition that would characterize his entire life. Without his parents' permission or support, he gathered a small force of mercenaries and sailed to England, apparently believing he could succeed where his mother had failed. The expedition was a complete failure. Henry couldn't even pay his mercenaries and had to be bailed out, embarrassingly, by King Stephen himself, who perhaps saw no threat in the young boy's amateur military adventure. But this early failure taught Henry valuable lessons about the importance of preparation, resources, and timing in military campaigns. He returned to Normandy, where his father was grooming him for leadership. Geoffrey recognised in his eldest son qualities that surpassed his own considerable abilities. Henry had inherited his father's red hair and fierce energy, but also possessed his mother's iron will and imperial bearing. More importantly, he had a genius for administration and law that would transform the chaotic feudal structures of his time into something approaching a modern state. Geoffrey's death in September 1151, at the young age of 38, marked a crucial transition. Some said he died from fever after swimming in a cold river on a hot day. Others whispered of poison, that constant spectre haunting medieval politics. Whatever the cause, he left his son, Henry, as Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou at just 18 years old. On his deathbed, Geoffrey allegedly told Henry never to stay still, to always be moving, planning, acting, for a stationary king was a vulnerable king. This advice would shape Henry's entire approach to kingship. The young Duke immediately proved himself worthy of his inheritance. Where his father had been methodical, Henry was explosive in his energy. Where Geoffrey had been content with regional power, Henry's ambitions stretched across the known world. His first great coup came through marriage, demonstrating that in medieval politics, a strategic wedding could be worth a dozen military victories. Eleanor of Aquitaine was, without question, the most remarkable woman of the 12th century, perhaps of the entire Middle Ages. When Henry met her in 1151, she was 30, beautiful, cultured, and possessed of a fiery independence that had already scandalized Europe. She was also Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, controlling lands that stretched from the Loire to the Pyrenees, making her the greatest heiress in Europe. Most significantly for Henry, she was in the process of divorcing King Louis VII of France. Her marriage annulled on grounds of consanguinity, though everyone knew the real reason was their fundamental incompatibility and failure to produce a male heir. Eleanor had accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, riding to Jerusalem not as a mere noble wife, but as a feudal lord leading her own vassals. Stories of her conduct in the Holy Land had spread across Europe. Tales of her relationship with her uncle Raymond of Antioch that went beyond familial affection, of her wearing armour and riding with her ladies dressed as Amazons. Whether these stories were true or malicious gossip mattered less than what they revealed about Eleanor's character. Here was a woman who refused to be confined by the conventions of her time. The attraction between Henry and Eleanor was immediate and intense. Despite the 12-year age difference, they recognised in each other kindred spirits, ambitious, passionate, intellectual, and utterly determined to shape the world according to their will. Their marriage, conducted with almost unseemly haste just 8 weeks after Eleanor's annulment, sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe. Louis VII, realising too late what he had lost, could only watch in horror as his greatest rival married his former wife and gained control of her vast territories. The wedding took place in Poitiers Cathedral on May 18th, 1152, a deliberately modest affair given the circumstances. Eleanor wore a gown of her favourite colour, a deep crimson that complemented her dark hair and eyes, while Henry appeared in the blue and gold that would become associated with Plantagenet royalty. The ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Bordeaux, and the guest list was limited to their most trusted supporters, for both knew that their marriage would provoke immediate political and possibly military responses. With this marriage, Henry now controlled a territory that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic coast to the boundaries of the French royal domain. This collection of territories, later known as the Angevin Empire, was larger than the Kingdom of France itself. It was an unprecedented accumulation of power in the hands of one man who was not yet even a king. But Henry was determined to claim his royal birthright. The situation in England had changed dramatically by 1153. The anarchy had exhausted everyone. Nobles, clergy, and common people alike yearned for peace and stable government. Stephen's son Eustace, his designated heir, died suddenly in August 1153. Some said struck down by God for plundering church lands. Stephen himself was ageing and tired, worn down by nearly 2 decades of civil war. Henry landed in England in January 1153 with a small but professional army, prepared for a long campaign, but he found that the appetite for war had largely evaporated. Instead of battles, there were negotiations. The Treaty of Wallingford, hammered out in November 1153, provided a solution that saved face for everyone involved. Stephen would remain king for his lifetime, but Henry would be recognised as his heir. It was a pragmatic solution to an intractable problem, though it required Henry to wait, something that did not come naturally to him. The waiting ended sooner than expected. Stephen died on October 25th, 1154, at Dover Castle, possibly of a stomach ailment that had plagued him for months. His death was peaceful, surrounded by monks praying for his soul, a gentle end for a man whose reign had been anything but peaceful. The news reached Henry in Normandy, where he was besieging a rebellious castle. Without hesitation, he abandoned the siege and sailed for England, arriving in early December, despite winter storms that made the Channel crossing treacherous. Henry II's coronation on December 19th, 1154, in Westminster Abbey marks not just the beginning of a new reign, but the dawn of a new age in English history. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political symbolism, designed to emphasise both continuity with the past and the promise of renewal. The young king, just 21 years old, walked barefoot to the abbey as a sign of humility, but once inside, he was transformed into an almost divine figure through the ancient rituals of coronation. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald, performed the ceremony with meticulous attention to detail, understanding that this moment needed to erase the uncertainties of the anarchy and establish Henry's legitimacy beyond question. The crown placed upon Henry's red gold hair was that of Edward the Confessor, linking the new king to the sainted Anglo-Saxon past. The sword he received represented his duty to defend the church and people, while the orb and sceptre symbolised his earthly power derived from divine authority. Eleanor stood beside him, crowned as queen, her presence a reminder of the vast continental empire that now answered to the English crown. Contemporary observers were struck by Henry's physical presence. He was of medium height but powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a barrel chest that suggested enormous physical strength. His hands were rough and scarred from constant riding and weapon practice, and his legs were slightly bowed from a lifetime in the saddle. But it was his energy that most impressed and sometimes exhausted those around him. Henry seemed to need almost no sleep, often working through the night on administrative matters before mounting his horse at dawn to travel to another part of his realm. His court was perpetually in motion, a travelling government that might be in London one week, Rouen the next, and Bordeaux the week after that. Courtiers complained of the hardships of keeping up with a king who thought nothing of covering 40 miles in a day, changing horses multiple times while maintaining a punishing pace. Peter of Blois, one of his clerks, wrote with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion about serving a king who never sits down except to eat or ride, and who conducted business while walking, his secretaries scrambling to keep up while taking dictation. This restless energy was matched by an intellectual curiosity that set Henry apart from most medieval monarchs. He spoke multiple languages fluently, French in various dialects, Latin with scholarly precision, and enough English to communicate with his Saxon subjects, though French remained the language of court. He had been educated by some of the finest minds of his age, including William of Conquests, who had introduced him to the classics and to new ideas about natural philosophy that were beginning to filter into Europe from Arabic sources. Henry's approach to kingship was revolutionary in its systematic nature. Where previous kings had ruled through personal relationships and ad hoc decisions, Henry began creating institutional structures that could function regardless of the king's presence. He understood that his vast territories could not be governed by one man's personal attention alone, no matter how energetic that man might be. Instead, he needed systems, laws, and administrators who could act in his name while maintaining consistent policies across his diverse realms. The legal reforms that Henry initiated would prove to be his most lasting legacy. When he came to the throne, English law was a chaotic patchwork of local customs, feudal privileges, and competing jurisdictions. Church courts claimed authority over broad areas of life. Baronial courts dispensed justice according to local tradition, and royal justice was available only to those with direct access to the king. Henry set about creating a unified system of royal law that would apply throughout England, administered by professional judges rather than local magnates. The system of royal judges that Henry established was revolutionary. These men, trained in law rather than warfare, would travel on regular circuits throughout England, bringing royal justice to every shire. They operated according to standardised procedures, using writs, formal written commands, that initiated legal proceedings in a consistent manner. The development of these writs, each designed for specific legal situations, created a framework of law that was predictable and accessible to anyone who could afford the modest fees required to purchase them. One of Henry's most significant innovations was the jury system, though it looked very different from modern juries. These were not groups of random citizens deciding guilt or innocence, but rather panels of local men who knew the facts of a case and could provide testimony about local customs and circumstances. The grand jury, or jury of presentment, would identify crimes that had been committed in their area, while trial juries would determine facts in civil disputes. This system gave local communities a role in royal justice, while ensuring that the king's law penetrated into every corner of the realm. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166 represented a watershed moment in legal history. This comprehensive legal reform established standardised procedures for criminal prosecution throughout England. It mandated that royal judges should visit each county regularly, that sheriffs should have lists of all criminals in their jurisdictions, and that accused criminals should be tried by ordeal if a jury presented them as suspects. While trial by ordeal seems barbaric to modern sensibilities, accused persons might be required to carry hot iron or be submerged in water to prove their innocence. It represented an attempt to bring divine judgment into a systematic legal framework. Henry's legal reforms extended beyond criminal law into property rights, particularly through the development of possessory assizes. These legal procedures allowed anyone who claimed to have been wrongfully dispossessed of land to purchase a writ requiring a jury to determine who had the better right to possession. The novel Decizin, Mort d'Ancestor, and Darrin Presentment became the foundation of English property law, creating predictable mechanisms for resolving disputes that had previously been settled through violence or political influence. But Henry's reign was far more than legal reform. His military campaigns demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond simple conquest. In Wales, he didn't attempt to conquer the entire country, but instead established a system of client relationships with Welsh princes, recognising their authority in exchange for acknowledgement of his overlordship. This pragmatic approach avoided the enormous costs of total conquest while still extending English influence into Welsh territories. His relationship with Scotland followed a similar pattern. When King William, the Lion of Scotland, was captured at the Battle of Alnwick in 1174, Henry could have attempted to annex Scotland entirely. Instead, he negotiated the Treaty of Falaise, which made Scotland a feudal dependency of England, while allowing William to continue ruling. This created a framework for English-Scottish relations that would persist, with variations and conflicts, for centuries. Ireland presented a different challenge and opportunity. The arrival of Norman adventurers in Ireland in 1169, initially invited by the deposed King of Leinster, Diarmait mac Murchada, created a situation that demanded Henry's attention. These Norman lords, particularly Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, were becoming too powerful and independent for Henry's comfort. In 1171, Henry himself travelled to Ireland with a substantial army, not to conquer but to establish his authority over both the Norman adventurers and the Irish kings. Henry's expedition to Ireland was remarkable for its combination of military display and diplomatic subtlety. He landed at Waterford with 500 knights and several thousand soldiers, a force large enough to demonstrate his power, but not so large as to provoke unified Irish resistance. He received the submission of both Norman lords and Irish kings, who saw in him a potential protector against their local enemies. The Treaty of Windsor in 1175 formalised these arrangements, with the High King of Ireland, Rhuaidri Ua Conchobar, recognising Henry's overlordship, while retaining authority over unconquered Irish territories. The administrative structure Henry established in Ireland would have profound historical consequences. He appointed Hugh de Lacy as Justiciar of Ireland, creating a colonial administration that operated parallel to but separate from English government. This established the framework for English, later British, involvement in Ireland that would persist for 8 centuries, with all the complexity, conflict, and tragedy that would entail. Henry's continental territories required different approaches. In Normandy he was Duke, successor to William the Conqueror and his ancestors. Here he could build on existing administrative structures, refining the sophisticated Norman system of governance that had been developing since the 10th century. He standardised the collection of revenues, regularised the administration of justice, and created a more professional bureaucracy centred on the exchequer at Caen. Anjou, his paternal inheritance, remained the emotional heart of his empire. Henry spent considerable time at Chinon Castle, perched above the Vienne River, which became his favourite residence, The castle, expanded and fortified during his reign, represented the military power that underpinned his authority. Its great hall could accommodate hundreds of courtiers and petitioners, while its private chambers provided space for the intimate family life that became increasingly complicated as his children grew to maturity. Aquitaine, Eleanor's duchy, presented unique challenges. This vast territory, with its distinctive culture influenced by troubadour poetry and southern traditions, had never been effectively governed by any external power. The Aquitanian nobility were fiercely independent, owing allegiance to Eleanor personally, rather than to abstract concepts of ducal authority. Henry's attempts to impose northern administrative methods on Aquitaine met with resistance that would eventually contribute to the great rebellions that marked his later reign. The management of such diverse territories required not just administrative skill, but also careful attention to symbolic representation of power. Henry understood the importance of architecture in demonstrating royal authority. Throughout his territories, he commissioned or expanded castles that served both military and administrative functions. Dover Castle, reconstructed during his reign, became one of the most formidable fortresses in Europe, its concentric walls and massive keep representing the permanence of royal power. But castles were only part of Henry's architectural legacy. He also patronised religious institutions, understanding that the church was not just a spiritual authority, but also a crucial partner in governance. His foundation of Witham Charterhouse, the first Carthusian monastery in England, demonstrated his commitment to the new reformed religious orders that were transforming European Christianity. The austere Carthusians, with their emphasis on contemplation and manual labour, represented a spiritual ideal that contrasted with the worldliness that Henry himself embodied. This relationship between secular and religious authority would produce the greatest crisis of Henry's reign. Thomas Becket, whom Henry appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, had been his closest friend and most trusted administrator as Chancellor. Henry assumed that Becket would continue to serve royal interests in his new ecclesiastical role, creating a partnership between Crown and Church that would strengthen both. Instead, Becket underwent a dramatic transformation, embracing his religious duties with the same intensity he had previously devoted to secular administration. The conflict between Henry and Becket was not simply a personal quarrel between former friends, but a fundamental dispute about the relationship between secular and religious authority. At its heart lay the question of criminal clerks, members of the clergy accused of crimes. Church courts claimed exclusive jurisdiction over clerical criminals, often imposing lighter penalties than secular courts would demand. Henry saw this as an unacceptable limitation on royal justice, particularly given that anyone who could read Latin could claim clerical status, creating a vast category of people effectively immune from royal law. The Constitutions of Clarendon, promulgated in January 1164, represented Henry's attempt to codify what he claimed were traditional customs governing church-state relations. Among their provisions was the requirement that clerks convicted in church courts should be handed over to royal authorities for punishment, eliminating the benefit of clergy that allowed criminals to escape serious consequences. Becket initially agreed to the constitutions, but then dramatically reversed himself, claiming they violated canon law and the independence of the church. The escalating conflict saw Becket flee to France in 1164, where he spent 6 years in exile, thundering condemnations at Henry from the safety of French monasteries. The dispute became international, with Pope Alexander III trying to mediate between his need for Henry's political support and his obligation to defend church privileges. King Louis VII of France delighted in harbouring Henry's troublesome archbishop, using Becket as a weapon against his Plantagenet rival. The apparent reconciliation between Henry and Becket in 1170 proved tragically temporary. Becket returned to Canterbury in December 1170, but immediately renewed his confrontation with royal authority, excommunicating bishops who had participated in the coronation of Henry's son, young Henry, as co-king. When news of these actions reached Henry in Normandy, he exploded in one of his characteristic rages. The exact words he spoke have been debated by historians, but their intent was clear. He wanted someone to rid him of this troublesome priest. 4 knights took the king's words as a command. Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard le Breton crossed to England and made their way to Canterbury. On December 29th, 1170, they confronted Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. The archbishop refused to flee or recant, meeting his death with a courage that transformed him instantly from controversial politician to holy martyr. The knights struck him down before the altar, splitting his skull and spilling his brains on the cathedral floor, an act of sacrilege that shocked all of Christendom. The murder of Becket was a disaster for Henry's reputation and authority. The king who had worked so hard to create systematic royal justice was now seen as a tyrant who murdered holy men. Henry's public penance in 1174, when he walked barefoot to Canterbury and submitted to flogging by monks, demonstrated the severity of the political and spiritual crisis. Yet even this humiliation was calculated. Henry understood that accepting responsibility and showing contrition was the only way to move past the crisis. The Becket affair coincided with growing tensions within Henry's own family that would dominate his final years. His sons, young Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, had inherited the Plantagenet temperament without the discipline that had made their father successful. Young Henry, crowned as co-king in 1170, possessed all the chivalric virtues of a medieval prince. He was handsome, generous, skilled in arms, and beloved by the troubadours who celebrated his courtly qualities. But he lacked real power, a king in name but not in authority, dependent on his father for money, and constantly frustrated by his ceremonial role. Richard, the second son, was different. Where young Henry was charming but ineffective, Richard possessed a military genius that would earn him the sobriquet Lionheart. Even as a teenager, he demonstrated remarkable ability in warfare, combining personal courage with tactical innovation. Eleanor had designated him as her heir in Aquitaine, and Richard spent his youth learning to govern that turbulent duchy, developing the skills in siege warfare that would later make him legendary. Geoffrey, the third son, was perhaps the most intelligent, but also the most duplicitous. Contemporary chroniclers described him as eloquent and persuasive, but utterly untrustworthy, capable of betraying anyone for advantage. His marriage to Constance of Brittany made him Duke of Brittany, adding another piece to the complex puzzle of Plantagenet territories. John, the youngest, was initially called Lackland because there seemed to be no inheritance left for him, a situation that bred resentment and ambition in equal measure. Eleanor's role in the family dynamics was crucial and complex. Her marriage to Henry had produced 8 children who survived to adulthood, but the passion that had brought them together had long since turned to bitter antagonism. Eleanor resented Henry's numerous infidelities, particularly his long relationship with Rosamund Clifford, the fair Rosamund of legend. More fundamentally, she objected to Henry's attempts to govern Aquitaine directly, rather than through her, seeing this as a violation of the independence she had maintained even during her marriage to Louis. The Great Rebellion of 1173–74 brought these family tensions to a violent climax. Eleanor and her 3 eldest sons united against Henry, supported by King Louis of France, King William of Scotland, and numerous rebellious barons. It was the greatest crisis of Henry's reign, threatening to destroy everything he had built. The rebellion had multiple causes: the sons' frustration with their lack of real power, Eleanor's desire to assert her independence, and the opportunism of Henry's enemies who saw a chance to humble the great king. Henry responded with characteristic energy and strategic brilliance. Despite being outnumbered and facing enemies on multiple fronts, he managed to defeat his opponents in detail. His mercenary armies, paid from the vast revenues his administrative reforms had generated, proved more reliable than the feudal levies of his enemies. The capture of William of Scotland at Alnwick was a crucial turning point, eliminating one major threat and demonstrating that fortune still favoured the old king. Eleanor's capture, while trying to escape to France dressed as a man, became one of the legendary moments of the conflict. Whether this disguise was actually attempted or was a later embellishment, her imprisonment marked the end of her active political role for the remainder of Henry's reign. She would spend the next 15 years in comfortable but strict confinement, moved between various English castles, a powerful woman reduced to powerlessness by the husband she had once loved. The suppression of the rebellion demonstrated Henry's resilience, but it didn't solve the underlying problems. Young Henry continued to chafe at his lack of real authority, eventually dying of dysentery in 1183 while engaged in another rebellion against his father. His death scene was touching in its pathos. The young king, realizing he was dying, sent a message to his father, begging forgiveness and asking that his debts be paid. Henry, grief-stricken at the loss of his eldest son despite their conflicts, reportedly said that he would gladly have given all his realms to have his son back. The death of young Henry rearranged the succession, making Richard the heir apparent to England, Normandy, and Anjou. But Richard had no intention of giving up Aquitaine, which he had come to see as his personal domain. The situation was further complicated by Henry's clear preference for John, his youngest son, whom he attempted to provide for at his older brother's expense. This favouritism toward John would have fatal consequences, creating new conflicts that would pursue Henry literally to his deathbed. Henry's final years were marked by increasing weariness and cynicism. The energy that had once allowed him to govern an empire through sheer force of personality was fading. He grew fat and bitter, suspicious of everyone around him, aware that his own family was waiting for him to die. The administrative structures he had created continued to function, generating revenues and dispensing justice, but the personal magnetism that had held his diverse territories together was weakening. The final rebellion came in 1189, with Richard allying with Philip Augustus, the young king of France who had succeeded Louis in 1180. Philip was everything Louis had not been: cunning, patient, and utterly focused on expanding French royal power at Plantagenet expense. He exploited the divisions in Henry's family with masterful skill, supporting Richard's rebellion while secretly planning to dismember the Angevin Empire once Henry was gone. The last meeting between Henry and Richard at Ballon-Mireille in July 1189 was a scene of profound humiliation for the once mighty king. Ill and defeated, Henry was forced to accept terms that were effectively made. Richard independence and recognised him as sole heir. When Henry received the list of those who had betrayed him, John's name was at the top. This final betrayal by his favourite son broke something in the old king. He turned his face to the wall and muttered, "Shame, shame on a conquered king," words that would echo through history as the epitaph of a great monarch brought low by those he loved most. Henry died at Chinon Castle on July 6, 1189, attended only by a few faithful servants. His body was carried to Fontevraud Abbey, where he was buried in the church he had helped build. Legend says that when Richard came to view his father's body, blood flowed from the corpse's nose, a sign in medieval belief that the murderer was present. Whether true or not, the story captures the tragic nature of Henry's end. Destroyed by the family he had hoped would continue his legacy, Richard I entered into his inheritance with all the ceremony and grandeur that had been denied his father at the end. His coronation at Westminster Abbey on September 3rd, 1189, was a spectacle designed to announce that a new kind of king had arrived. Where Henry had been an administrator and lawgiver, Richard would be a warrior and crusader, embodying the chivalric ideals that were transforming European aristocratic culture. The coronation itself was meticulously choreographed to emphasize Richard's masculine warrior virtues. He walked to the abbey under a silk canopy carried by 4 barons, wearing a simple tunic that would be exchanged for the magnificent coronation robes. At 6 feet tall, with golden red hair and piercing blue eyes, Richard looked every inch the warrior king. His physical presence dominated the abbey as he strode to the altar, his hand already comfortable on the sword hilt that seemed a natural extension of his body. But this glorious ceremony was marred by horrible violence that would stain Richard's reputation. Jewish leaders who had come to offer gifts and congratulations to the new king were barred from the coronation banquet and attacked by the crowd. The violence spread through London, with Jewish homes burned and many killed in what became one of the worst pogroms in English medieval history. Richard, focused entirely on his crusading plans, issued orders to stop the violence, but took no real action to punish the perpetrators, seeing the disorder as a distraction from his real purpose. For Richard, everything was subordinate to the crusade. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in October 1187, shocking Christian Europe and prompting Pope Gregory VIII to call for a new crusade. Richard had taken the cross even before his father's death, and now as king he could marshal the resources of England for this holy war. But resources were what he needed most, and Richard approached the gathering of funds with single-minded determination that bordered on obsession. The new king treated England essentially as a bank to fund his crusade. He sold offices, titles and lands to anyone who could pay. He allegedly said he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. Sheriffs who had purchased their offices from Henry were forced to buy them again from Richard. Towns were granted charters of self-governance in exchange for substantial payments. The Scottish king, William the Lion, was released from his feudal obligations under the Treaty of Falaise for 10,000 marks, essentially selling Scotland's independence back to itself. This massive fundraising campaign raised unprecedented sums, but also created long-term problems. By selling so many royal rights and properties, Richard weakened the crown's long-term financial position. More immediately, it created a perception that everything in Richard's England was for sale, undermining the careful administrative structures his father had built. But Richard didn't care about long-term consequences. His mind was fixed on Jerusalem and the glory that would come from its recovery. Richard's preparations for the crusade went beyond mere fundraising. He understood that this expedition required careful diplomatic and military planning. He negotiated an alliance with Philip Augustus of France, his recent enemy who had also taken the cross. This alliance was always fragile, built on mutual necessity rather than trust, but it was essential for a successful crusade. The two kings agreed to divide any conquests equally and to support each other throughout the expedition. The journey to the Holy Land itself became an epic adventure that enhanced Richard's legendary status. Rather than taking the overland route through Byzantine territory, Richard chose to sail, allowing him to stop in Sicily, where his sister Joanna was widowed queen. The new Sicilian king, Tancred, had imprisoned Joanna and seized her dowry, providing Richard with an excuse for his first military action of the Crusade. Richard's conquest of Messina in October 1190 demonstrated his military prowess and his capacity for dramatic gesture. When negotiations with Tancred broke down, Richard assaulted the city with characteristic fury. His soldiers erected his banners on the city walls, treating Messina as a conquered enemy rather than a Christian city. The sight of English banners flying over a Sicilian city enraged Philip Augustus, who had arrived separately and saw this as a violation of their agreement to share conquests. The winter spent in Sicily saw the relationship between Richard and Philip deteriorate further. Philip, physically smaller and less charismatic than Richard, resented the English king's dominance and popularity. Richard's decision to break his betrothal to Philip's sister Alice, whom he had been engaged to since childhood, and instead marry Berengaria of Navarre, added personal insult to political rivalry. The marriage to Berengaria, conducted in Cyprus in May 1191, was purely strategic, designed to secure Navarre's support for English interests in southern France. The conquest of Cyprus showed Richard at his tactical best. The island's ruler, Isaac Komnenos, had insulted Richard by imprisoning crusaders who had been shipwrecked on his shores. Richard's response was swift and decisive. He landed with his army, defeated Isaac in battle, and conquered the entire island in less than a month. Cyprus would provide a crucial supply base for the Crusader states for the next century, demonstrating Richard's strategic understanding that went beyond simple battlefield prowess. Richard finally arrived at Acre in June 1191, where the Crusader army had been besieging the city for nearly 2 years. His arrival transformed the siege. Where the previous efforts had been desultory and uncoordinated, Richard brought energy, resources, and tactical innovation. He supervised the construction of massive siege engines, including a great catapult nicknamed Malvoisin, or Bad Neighbour, that could hurl stones weighing 300 pounds at the city walls. But Richard also suffered from the diseases that plagued the Crusader camp. He fell ill with Arnaldia, a scurvy-like condition that caused his hair and nails to fall out. Even sick, he had himself carried to the walls on a silken bed, where he used a crossbow to pick off defenders, demonstrating that the legendary Lionheart would not be stopped by mere physical weakness. His presence inspired the Crusaders and demoralized the defenders, who recognized they faced a different kind of enemy. The fall of Acre on July 12, 1191, was a great victory, but it was immediately followed by actions that would forever tarnish Richard's reputation in Muslim eyes. When Saladin delayed in meeting the surrender terms, particularly the payment of ransom for the garrison, Richard ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners in full view of Saladin's army. This massacre, conducted in cold blood, shocked even contemporary Christian chroniclers who generally supported Richard. It demonstrated a ruthless pragmatism beneath the chivalric exterior, a willingness to commit atrocity when it served strategic purposes. The march south from Acre toward Jerusalem showcased Richard's tactical genius. Understanding that Saladin's strength lay in his mobile cavalry, Richard organized his army in a defensive formation that neutralized this advantage. The infantry marched in close formation on the landward side, protecting the cavalry and baggage train that moved along the coast. The crossbowmen, whom Richard particularly favoured, created a deadly barrier that Muslim cavalry couldn't penetrate without catastrophic losses. The Battle of Arsuf on September 7th, 1191, was Richard's masterpiece. Saladin attempted to provoke the Crusaders into breaking formation with repeated cavalry charges and arrow storms. Richard held his army in iron discipline, refusing to allow any response until the perfect moment. When he finally ordered the charge, it was devastating. The military orders The Templars and Hospitallers led the assault with Richard himself at the centre, his golden lion's banner streaming above the melee. The Muslim army broke and fled, giving Richard a victory that resonated throughout both Christian and Muslim worlds. Yet despite this triumph, Richard never reached Jerusalem. 3 times he approached the Holy City, and 3 times he turned back. This decision, which seemed inexplicable to many crusaders who had come so far to pray at the Holy Sepulchre, showed Richard's strategic intelligence. He understood that even if he could take Jerusalem, holding it without controlling the surrounding territory and castles would be impossible. The Crusader states needed a sustainable military position, not a symbolic victory that would be immediately reversed. The negotiations with Saladin revealed a different side of Richard, one capable of diplomacy and cultural appreciation. The 2 great warriors developed a curious respect for each other, exchanging gifts and courteous messages even while their armies fought. Richard allegedly offered to marry his sister Joanna to Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, with the couple ruling Jerusalem jointly, though this proposal was probably never serious. These negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Jaffa in September 1192, which allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while leaving the city in Muslim hands. Richard's journey home became another legendary adventure. Shipwrecked near Venice, he attempted to cross Europe in disguise, knowing that he had many enemies who would pay well for his capture. His route took him through the territories of Leopold of Austria, whom he had mortally insulted at Acre by tearing down his banner from the city walls. Leopold's men captured Richard near Vienna in December 1192, allegedly recognising him in a tavern kitchen where the king, maintaining his disguise as a pilgrim, was turning a spit with a valuable ring still on his finger. Richard's captivity became one of the great romantic episodes of medieval history. Leopold transferred him to Emperor Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom of 150,000 marks, equivalent to 2 years' income from England. The stories of this captivity, of Richard composing songs with the troubadour Blondel, of his proud defiance before the imperial diet, of loyal subjects searching for their lost king, became the stuff of legend, though most were later embellishments. Eleanor of Aquitaine, freed from captivity after Henry's death, worked tirelessly to raise her son's ransom. The effort required extraordinary measures, new taxes, the confiscation of church treasures, and the mortgage of royal estates. Every social class contributed, though not always willingly. The Cistercian monks, who claimed exemption from secular taxes, were forced to contribute their entire year's wool crop. The effort demonstrated both the administrative efficiency of the English state and the personal loyalty Richard could still inspire despite his absence. Prince John, Richard's younger brother, worked actively to prevent his brother's release. He allied with Philip Augustus, who had returned from Crusade early and was now systematically attacking Plantagenet territories in France. John promised to marry Philip's sister and cede substantial territories in exchange for French support of his claim to the throne. Their combined efforts to keep Richard imprisoned failed when the ransom was finally paid, and Richard was released in February 1194. Richard's return to England in March 1194 was brief but dramatic. He immediately set about punishing those who had supported John's rebellion, though he showed surprising mercy to his brother himself, dismissively saying that John was a child who had been led astray by evil counsellors. After just 2 months in England, Richard left for France, never to return. The remainder of his reign would be spent fighting to recover the territories Philip had seized during his captivity. These final years of warfare in France showed Richard at his military peak. The construction of Chateau Gaillard, his great fortress overlooking the Seine, demonstrated his mastery of military architecture. Built in just 2 years at enormous cost, the castle incorporated every innovation in defensive design. Its concentric walls, carefully calculated angles of fire, and sophisticated gatehouse defences made it nearly impregnable. Richard allegedly declared, "If its walls were made of butter, I would hold it against the King of France." The warfare between Richard and Philip was characterised by the brutal tactics of the time. Both kings employed mercenary companies who devastated the countryside, burning villages and destroying crops to deny resources to their enemies. Richard showed particular skill in siege warfare, developing new techniques for undermining walls and protecting attacking forces. At the Siege of Acre, he had introduced the use of protective mantlets on wheels, allowing crossbowmen to approach walls under cover. These innovations would influence military tactics for generations. Richard's death came suddenly and unexpectedly at the minor siege of Châlus-Chabrol in March 1199. A crossbow bolt fired from the castle walls struck him in the shoulder. The wound itself wasn't immediately fatal, but the surgeon's bungled attempt to remove the bolt led to gangrene. As Richard lay dying, he had the crossbowman who shot him brought before him. The man, named Peter Basile, claimed he had shot the king in revenge for Richard killing his father and brothers. Richard, in a final gesture of chivalric nobility, forgave the man and ordered him released with a gift of money, though his mercenary captain had the crossbowman flayed alive after Richard died. Richard died on April 6, 1199, in his mother Eleanor's arms. His last words were reportedly, "I leave everything to my brother John," though this may have been added later to legitimise John's succession. His body was buried at Fontevraud beside his father, while his heart was interred at Rouen Cathedral and his entrails at Châlus. This division of his body reflected the medieval belief in the symbolic importance of different organs and the desire of multiple locations to claim connection to the legendary king. Richard's legacy was complex and contradictory. As a military commander, he was perhaps the finest of his age, combining personal courage with tactical innovation and strategic vision. His reputation among both Christians and Muslims as the epitome of chivalric kingship would endure for centuries. The legends that grew around him, Robin Hood's royal patron, the singing king searching for Jerusalem, the lion-hearted warrior who made Saladin tremble, overshadowed the historical reality of a king who spent less than 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. John entered into his inheritance under a cloud of suspicion and illegitimacy that would shadow his entire reign. His succession was not automatic or uncontested. Arthur of Brittany, the son of John's deceased older brother Geoffrey, had a strong claim to the throne by the principle of primogeniture. 12 years old at Richard's death, Arthur was supported by the nobility of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, who proclaimed him as their duke. Philip Augustus of France, ever ready to exploit Plantagenet divisions, immediately recognised Arthur's claims and took the boy under his protection. John moved with uncharacteristic speed to secure his position. He raced to Chinon to seize the Angevin treasury, then to Rouen, where he was invested as Duke of Normandy on April 25, 1199. His coronation as King of England took place on Ascension Day, May 27th, at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was marked by an ill omen when John, nervous and laughing inappropriately during the solemn moments, dropped the lance that symbolised his military authority. Some chroniclers claimed he seemed almost drunk, though this may have been nervous exhaustion rather than wine. Contemporary descriptions of John paint a picture strikingly different from his warrior brother. He was short, perhaps 5 feet 5 inches, with a tendency toward corpulence that increased with age. His dark hair and beard framed a face that chroniclers described as cunning rather than noble, with restless eyes that never seemed to focus on the person he was addressing. He dressed magnificently, with a particular fondness for jewels and rich fabrics that some saw as effeminate in comparison to Richard's martial simplicity. But John's most striking characteristic was his mercurial temperament. He could shift from charming generosity to vindictive cruelty without warning. One day he might shower a courtier with gifts and honours. The next, the same man might find himself imprisoned or exiled on a whim. This unpredictability made him deeply unsettling to the nobility, who never knew where they stood with their king. Unlike his father's calculated rages or Richard's straightforward anger, John's emotions seemed genuinely uncontrolled, making him dangerous in ways that went beyond normal medieval royal tyranny. John's intellectual abilities were considerable, perhaps exceeding those of his more celebrated brothers. He was literate in Latin and French, with a genuine interest in administration and law that recalled his father's talents. His library travelled with him, containing not just religious texts, but also histories and romances that he read for pleasure. He understood the machinery of government with a sophistication that should have made him an effective ruler. Yet these talents were undermined by character flaws that turned potential strengths into catastrophic weaknesses. Philip summoned John to appear before him as Duke of Aquitaine to answer charges brought by the Lusignans. When John refused, claiming that as King of England he owed no service to the French crown, Philip declared all John's French fiefs forfeit for contumacy. This legal pretext allowed Philip to launch a war of conquest that had probably been his intention all along. The French king had spent Richard's reign building his resources and studying Plantagenet weaknesses. Now, facing John instead of Richard, he was ready to strike. The war that followed demonstrated John's military inadequacy, where Richard had been everywhere at once, inspiring his troops and terrifying his enemies. John seemed paralysed by indecision. He would begin a campaign with energy, then abandon it suddenly for no apparent reason. His treatment of his allies was catastrophic. He would promise support, then fail to appear, leaving those who had declared for him to face Philip's vengeance alone. The fate of Arthur of Brittany became the defining atrocity of John's reign. Captured at the Battle of Mirebeau in August 1202, initially a rare victory for John, the young duke disappeared into John's custody and was never seen again. The most credible accounts suggest that John, drunk and furious, murdered his nephew with his own hands at Rouen Castle in April 1203, then had the body weighted with stones and thrown into the Seine. Whether or not John personally committed the murder, he was universally believed responsible, and the crime shocked even the brutal standards of medieval politics. Arthur's murder transformed the political situation entirely. The Breton nobility, who might have been reconciled to John's rule, became implacable enemies. More importantly, it gave Philip Augustus moral justification for his war of conquest. The French king could now present himself as the champion of justice against a tyrannical murderer. Norman nobles, already wavering in their loyalty, began defecting to Philip in increasing numbers. The collapse of John's continental empire was stunningly rapid. Château Gaillard, Richard's impregnable fortress, fell to Philip in March 1204 after a brilliant siege that demonstrated French military innovation. The castle's capture was achieved through a combination of mining, siege engines, and a daring assault through the latrine chutes that bypassed the main defences. With Château Gaillard gone, Normandy lay open to French conquest. John's response to the crisis was to flee to England, abandoning his continental supporters to their fate. This desertion completed the collapse of loyalty among the Norman nobility. City after city, castle after castle, surrendered to Philip without resistance. By 1204, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine had all fallen to the French crown. Of the great Angevin Empire, only Aquitaine remained, held more through Eleanor's personal authority than John's, and even that would be greatly reduced. The loss of Normandy was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological and cultural catastrophe for the English monarchy and nobility. Since 1066, the Anglo-Norman realm had been a cross-channel entity. The English barons held lands on both sides of the channel, with their Norman estates often more valuable than their English holdings. Now, they were forced to choose between their English and French lands, a choice that fundamentally altered the nature of the English aristocracy and began the transformation of England from a province of a continental empire into an insular kingdom. John's attempts to recover his lost territories consumed the remainder of his reign and ultimately led to his downfall. The campaigns required money on an unprecedented scale, forcing John to exploit every possible source of revenue. He pushed the financial mechanisms his father had created beyond their breaking point. Scutage, the payment in lieu of military service, was levied almost annually instead of occasionally. The forest laws, always unpopular, were enforced with new severity, with vast areas declared royal forest and subject to special jurisdiction and fines. John's treatment of the nobility became increasingly arbitrary and oppressive. He demanded enormous sums for inheritance rights, charged widows huge fees to remain unmarried or to choose their own husbands, and took hostages from noble families to ensure loyalty. His sexual predations on the wives and daughters of his barons became notorious. Robert Fitzwalter claimed John had attempted to seduce his daughter, while Eustace de Vesci fled to Scotland after John allegedly pursued his wife. Whether all these accusations were true mattered less than the fact that they were widely believed. The Church, which might have been John's ally against rebellious barons, became another enemy through his disastrous handling of the Canterbury election. When Archbishop Hubert Walter died in 1205, John attempted to force through his own candidate, John de Grey. The monks of Canterbury elected their sub-prior Reginald instead, leading to a disputed election that was appealed to Pope Innocent III. Innocent, one of the most powerful popes in history, rejected both candidates and imposed Stephen Langton, an English cardinal residing in Rome. John's refusal to accept Langton led to a papal interdict on England in 1208, effectively closing all churches and suspending all religious services except baptism and last rites. For a deeply religious society, this was catastrophic. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. Couples couldn't marry in churches, and the regular rhythm of religious life that structured medieval existence was shattered. John's response was to seize church revenues, essentially holding the English church hostage. The personal excommunication of John in 1209 made him technically no longer a Christian king, releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. This gave moral justification to any rebellion and made John desperately vulnerable. Philip Augustus prepared to invade England with papal blessing, planning to place his son Louis on the English throne. Facing complete disaster, John finally submitted to the Pope in May 1213, accepting Langton as Archbishop and, most humiliatingly, surrendering England and Ireland to the papacy and receiving them back as papal fiefs. This submission to Rome solved John's immediate crisis, but created new problems. The barons who had supported him against the church now felt betrayed, while those who had opposed him saw his submission as weakness. The financial burdens of his failed continental campaigns continued to mount. The defeat at the Battle of Bouvaines in July 1214, where John's allies were crushed by Philip Augustus, ended any realistic hope of recovering the lost territories, and left John facing a baronial opposition that had lost all respect for their king. The rebellion that produced Magna Carta began in the north, among barons who refused to pay the scutage John demanded for his failed campaigns. These northerners, as they were initially called, found support among barons throughout England who had grievances against John's arbitrary rule. By spring 1215, the rebels had taken London, the crucial, strategic and symbolic centre of the kingdom. John, isolated at Windsor, had no choice but to negotiate. The document sealed at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, was not intended as a constitutional milestone, but as a peace treaty between John and his barons. Its 63 clauses addressed specific grievances about feudal obligations, judicial procedures, and royal administration. Yet embedded within these practical provisions were principles that would resonate through centuries. The idea that the king was subject to law, that free men had rights that even kings must respect, and that taxation required some form of consent. The most famous clause, number 39 in the original charter, stated that no free man could be imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or destroyed except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. This principle, though initially applying only to the nobility, contained the seed of due process that would eventually grow into fundamental legal rights. The provision for a council of 25 barons to enforce the charter created, however briefly, a mechanism for limiting royal power that prefigured later parliamentary development. John had no intention of adhering to the charter, viewing it as a temporary expedient forced upon him by circumstances. He immediately appealed to Pope Innocent, now his overlord, who obligingly annulled Magna Carta as an illegal infringement on royal rights. This papal annulment transformed a baronial rebellion into a civil war. The barons, desperate, took the extraordinary step of offering the English crown to Louis, son of Philip Augustus, who invaded England in May 1216 with a substantial French army. The civil war that followed saw much of England divided between John and Louis. The elderly William Marshal, the greatest knight of his age, remained loyal to John despite his grievances, as did many of the northern earls who feared French domination more than they hated John. The war was characterised by the siege warfare that dominated medieval conflicts, with castles changing hands repeatedly and the countryside devastated by competing armies. John's death came suddenly in October 1216, in circumstances that invited speculation about poison, though dysentery was the more likely cause. He had been campaigning in East Anglia when he fell ill after what chroniclers described as a surfeit of peaches and new cider. His final days were spent in agony, carried in a litter between castles as his army retreated. The loss of his baggage train, including the crown jewels, while crossing the Wash seemed to symbolise the disasters of his reign. John died at Newark Castle on October 18th or 19th, 1216, with few mourners. His death transformed the political situation completely. The barons who had invited Louis to take the throne had done so in opposition to John personally, rather than the Plantagenet dynasty. With John dead and his 9-year-old son Henry available as an alternative, the justification for French intervention evaporated. William Marshal, appointed regent for young Henry III, reissued Magna Carta with modifications, removing the excuse for continued rebellion. The coronation of Henry III on October 28, 1216, at Gloucester Cathedral rather than Westminster, with a simple gold circlet instead of the lost crown jewels, symbolised the reduced state of the English monarchy. The 9-year-old boy who became king inherited a realm divided by civil war, with London and much of the southeast controlled by Prince Louis and rebel barons. Yet this child would reign for 56 years, longer than any English monarch before him, fundamentally transforming the nature of English kingship through both his successes and his failures. William Marshal, the aged Earl of Pembroke who served as regent, represented a link to the heroic age of Henry II and Richard the Lionheart. At 70 years old, he had served 4 kings and understood both the practical necessities of medieval governance and the importance of chivalric ideals. His first act was to reissue Magna Carta, demonstrating that the new regime would respect the limitations on royal power that John had died trying to overthrow. This transformation of Magna Carta from a failed peace treaty into a fundamental statement of law was perhaps the most important political development of Henry's minority. The defeat of Louis and the rebel barons came through a combination of military success and diplomatic skill. The Battle of Lincoln in May 1217, where the royalist forces defeated the French and rebel army, was followed by the naval victory at Sandwich that August, where the English fleet destroyed French reinforcements. But equally important was Marshall's policy of reconciliation, offering generous terms to rebels who returned to loyalty. By September 1217, Louis had agreed to withdraw from England in exchange for a payment of 10,000 marks, a face-saving gesture that allowed him to claim he had not been defeated. The minority government that ruled in Henry's name faced enormous challenges. The country had been devastated by civil war, royal authority had collapsed in many regions, and the crown was essentially bankrupt. Yet the Regency, first under William Marshall until his death in 1219, then under Hubert de Burgh, managed to restore order and begin rebuilding royal administration. The reissues of Magna Carta in 1217 and 1225, each time with modifications that made it more practical as a governing document, established the principle that English kings ruled under law rather than above it. Young Henry's character began to emerge as he grew toward maturity. Unlike his warrior ancestors, he was scholarly and artistic, with a genuine devotion to religion that went beyond conventional piety. He was particularly devoted to Edward the Confessor, the saintly Anglo-Saxon king whom he took as his model. This identification with the Confessor represented a conscious attempt to root the Plantagenet dynasty in English rather than Norman tradition, a significant shift in royal identity. Physically, Henry was of medium height, with drooping eyelid that gave him a distinctive appearance. He dressed magnificently, but not martially, preferring rich fabrics and jewels to armour and weapons. His interests were in architecture, art, and ceremony, rather than warfare and conquest. He could be generous to the point of profligacy, giving away money and lands impulsively, then finding himself unable to meet basic governmental expenses. This combination of artistic sensibility and financial irresponsibility would characterise his entire reign. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Provence in January 1236 brought significant changes to the English court. Eleanor, beautiful and cultured, but only 12 years old at her marriage, came with a large retinue of Provençal relatives who quickly established themselves in positions of power. The Savoyards, as they were collectively known, became a new force in English politics, resented by native barons who saw them as foreign parasites feeding on English wealth. The king's devotion to his wife was touching in its constancy, but politically problematic in its effects. Henry could refuse Eleanor nothing, indulging her expensive tastes and advancing her relatives regardless of their competence or the political consequences. Peter of Savoy, Eleanor's uncle, was granted the honour of Richmond and extensive lands in England. Boniface of Savoy became Archbishop of Canterbury, despite minimal qualifications for the position. These appointments created a faction of foreign-born magnates dependent entirely on royal favour, disrupting the traditional balance of English noble politics. Henry's greatest passion was for building an artistic patronage. His reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, begun in 1245, was intended to create a shrine worthy of Edward the Confessor and a coronation church that would rival the great cathedrals of France. The new abbey, built in the French Gothic style with soaring pointed arches and vast windows filled with coloured glass, represented an enormous financial commitment that continued throughout Henry's reign. The king personally supervised many details of construction, specifying the placement of paintings and sculptures, the design of floor tiles, and even the arrangement of liturgical furniture. The painted chamber at Westminster Palace, Henry's private apartment, became one of the wonders of medieval art. The walls were covered with paintings depicting biblical and historical scenes, including a great map of the world and illustrations from the Romance of Alexander. The king's bed was painted green with gold stars, surrounded by images of the guardians of Solomon's bed from the Song of Songs. Every surface was decorated with colour and gold, creating an environment of almost overwhelming richness that reflected Henry's aesthetic vision. But this cultural magnificence came at a price that England could not afford. Henry's financial management was catastrophically bad, combining his father's rapacity with none of John's administrative efficiency. He borrowed constantly from Italian bankers at ruinous interest rates, pledged future revenues that he had no realistic hope of collecting, and sold privileges and exemptions that undermined the very basis of royal authority. The Jews of England, traditional sources of royal finance, were squeezed so mercilessly that many were reduced to poverty, destroying their ability to provide future loans. Henry's foreign policy ambitions exceeded both his resources and abilities. His attempt to secure the crown of Sicily for his second son Edmund was particularly disastrous. In 1254, Pope Innocent IV offered Sicily to Henry on condition that he conquer it from the Hohenstaufen dynasty and pay the Pope 135,000 marks for the privilege. Henry accepted eagerly, seeing an opportunity to rival the continental empire of his ancestors. The scheme was absurdly unrealistic. Henry had neither the military resources to conquer Sicily nor the money to pay the Pope. Yet he committed England to this impossible venture, threatening to bankrupt the realm for a phantom crown. The crisis that would dominate Henry's later reign began to develop in the 1250s as baronial opposition to his misgovernment coalesced. The leader of this opposition was Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, a figure of extraordinary complexity and charisma. Simon was himself a foreigner born in France, but he had become more English than the English, embracing the cause of reform with religious fervour. His marriage to Henry's sister Eleanor in 1238 had made him part of the royal family, but his relationship with the king deteriorated from initial friendship to bitter enmity. Simon de Montfort combined military genius with political vision and religious intensity. He saw himself as a crusader for justice, called by God to reform the realm and protect the common people from royal oppression. His enemies saw him as an ambitious hypocrite, using high-minded rhetoric to advance his personal power. Both views contained truth. Simon was simultaneously an idealist and an opportunist, a reformer and a potential tyrant. The provisions of Oxford, forced upon Henry in June 1258, represented a revolutionary attempt to limit royal power. A council of 15 barons would effectively govern the realm, controlling all appointments and expenditures. Parliament would meet 3 times yearly, not at royal pleasure, but by fixed schedule. Royal castles would be held by native Englishmen, not foreigners. These provisions went far beyond Magna Carta, creating something approaching a constitutional monarchy with the king reduced to a figurehead. Henry accepted the provisions under duress but worked constantly to undermine them. He appealed to the Pope, who obligingly absolved him from his oath to observe them. He manoeuvred to divide the baronial opposition, exploiting tensions between moderate reformers and radicals. By 1261, he felt strong enough to repudiate the provisions entirely, leading to a complex period of negotiation and conflict that would eventually explode into civil war. The Second Barons' War, which began in 1264, was different from the conflict under John. This was not simply a rebellion against royal tyranny, but an ideological struggle about the nature of government itself. Simon de Montfort and his supporters articulated a vision of limited monarchy and broader political participation that was revolutionary for its time. They spoke of the community of the realm, suggesting that political authority derived from something beyond the king's personal will. The Battle of Lewes on May 14, 1264, saw Simon de Montfort's tactical genius defeat a larger royalist army. Henry himself was captured along with his son Edward, making Simon effectively the ruler of England. For 15 months, Simon de Montfort governed in the king's name, implementing reforms that would have lasting constitutional significance. His great parliament of January 1265 included not just barons and clergy, but also representatives from the towns and shires, creating the prototype for the House of Commons that would develop over subsequent centuries. This expansion of political participation was revolutionary, suggesting that governance required consent from beyond the traditional nobility. The knights of the shire and burgesses from the towns who attended Simon's parliament were there not as petitioners, but as participants with voices in the governance of the realm. This precedent, though born from Simon's need for broader support against royalist opposition, would fundamentally alter the trajectory of English constitutional development. But Simon's rule contained the seeds of its own destruction. His authoritarian tendencies alienated many who had initially supported reform. He granted himself and his sons vast estates and powers, suggesting that personal ambition motivated him as much as principle. The younger Simon de Montfort was particularly notorious for his arrogance and violence, treating former royalists with a vindictiveness that created new enemies for the regime. Prince Edward's escape from captivity in May 1265 changed everything. The future Edward I possessed military and political skills that his father utterly lacked. At 26, he was in his physical prime, tall and intimidating, with the Plantagenet energy and ruthlessness that Henry had never displayed. Edward quickly rallied royalist forces and began systematically undermining Simon's support, particularly among the Marcher lords who controlled the Welsh borderlands. The Battle of Evesham on August 4, 1265, was less a battle than a massacre. Edward's forces trapped Simon's smaller army in a loop of the River Avon, preventing escape. Simon knew he was doomed. He heard Mass that morning and prepared for death with the fatalism of a crusader. The battle was brief and brutal. Simon's Welsh infantry were slaughtered almost to a man, while Simon himself was killed, and his body mutilated with savage vindictiveness. His head, hands, feet, and genitals were cut off, the dismembered corpse a warning to future rebels. Yet Simon's death created a martyr. Miracles were reported at his grave, and common people began venerating him as a saint, much to royal displeasure. The Song of Lewes celebrated him as a defender of English liberty against royal tyranny. This popular canonization of a rebel demonstrated how deeply Simon's message had resonated beyond the baronial class. The idea that royal power should be limited by law and consent had taken root in English political consciousness. Henry's restoration after Evesham was surprisingly moderate, largely due to Edward's influence. The dictum of Kenilworth in October 1266 offered rebels the opportunity to redeem their lands by paying fines, allowing reconciliation rather than perpetual exclusion. The Statute of Marlborough in 1267 confirmed many reformist provisions while maintaining royal authority. These compromises, engineered by Edward rather than Henry, began healing the wounds of civil war. The final years of Henry's reign were relatively peaceful, but marked by the king's increasing withdrawal from active governance. Edward effectively ruled as regent, while Henry focused on completing Westminster Abbey and his religious devotions. The translation of Edward the Confessor's body to its new shrine in October 1269 was the crowning moment of Henry's life, a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence that fulfilled his lifetime ambition. Henry died on November 16th, 1272, at Westminster, appropriately in the palace he had spent so much time and money beautifying. His reign of 56 years had seen England transformed from a war-torn province of a failed continental empire into an increasingly unified kingdom with nascent parliamentary institutions. Though Henry himself was weak and often incompetent, his reign paradoxically strengthened English governance by forcing the development of institutions that could function despite royal inadequacy. Edward I arrived in England in August 1274, having been on crusade when his father died, secure in the knowledge that his succession was uncontested. This smooth transition, remarkable given England's history of disputed successions, testified to Edward's political strength and the stability that his effective regency had already brought. His coronation on August 19th at Westminster Abbey was a magnificent affair that announced the arrival of a new kind of king, one who combined the warrior prowess of Richard with the administrative genius of Henry II. Edward's physical presence dominated any room he entered. At 6 feet 2 inches, he towered over most contemporaries, with long arms and legs that gave him advantages in combat and horsemanship. His hair was initially black but turned snow-white in middle age, creating a striking appearance that enhanced his natural authority. He had a slight lisp that became more pronounced when angry, and a drooping left eyelid inherited from his father. But these minor imperfections only humanized what was otherwise an almost overwhelming royal presence. His personality combined intellectual sophistication with brutal pragmatism. Edward was literate in Latin, French, and English, with a genuine interest in law and history that informed his approach to governance. He could debate legal principles with learned clerks, then switch seamlessly to planning military campaigns with hardened soldiers. This versatility made him equally comfortable in the courtroom and on the battlefield, understanding that medieval kingship required mastery of both. Edward's marriage to Eleanor of Castile was that rarity among royal unions, a genuine love match that lasted throughout their lives. Eleanor accompanied Edward on crusade and on many of his campaigns, bearing him 16 children despite the hardships of constant travel. When she died in 1290 at Harby in Nottinghamshire, Edward's grief was profound and genuine. The Eleanor crosses, 12 elaborate monuments marking the stages of her funeral procession to Westminster, stand as testimony to a king's love for his queen, each one a masterpiece of Gothic sculpture. The early years of Edward's reign focused on legal and administrative reform. The Statute of Westminster of 1275 began a comprehensive overhaul of English law that would continue throughout his reign. Edward understood that effective governance required clear, consistent laws efficiently administered. His statutes addressed everything from property rights to criminal procedures, creating a legal framework that would endure for centuries. The Quo Warranto proceedings, beginning in 1278, demonstrated Edward's determination to assert royal authority over feudal privileges. Royal commissioners demanded that lords show by what warrant they claimed various judicial and administrative rights. Those who couldn't produce valid charters had their privileges revoked, returning authority to the crown. This systematic attack on feudal particularism strengthened royal power while creating more uniform governance throughout England. Edward's conquest of Wales represented the first great military achievement of his reign. The Welsh princes had maintained effective independence despite nominal English overlordship, with Llewellyn ap Gruffydd styling himself Prince of Wales and acting as a sovereign ruler. Edward's determination to reduce Wales to direct English control combined strategic calculation with personal ambition to complete the British conquests that had eluded his predecessors. The First Welsh War of 1276–77 demonstrated Edward's methodical approach to conquest. Rather than seeking dramatic battlefield victories, he systematically isolated Llywelyn through diplomatic pressure and economic blockade. The Treaty of Aberconwy forced Llywelyn to surrender all Welsh territories, except Gwynedd, and to acknowledge Edward's sovereignty. But this was merely the first stage of Edward's plans. The Second Welsh War of 1282–83 was a campaign of conquest and colonisation. When Llywelyn's brother, Dafydd, rebelled, providing a pretext for war, Edward launched a carefully planned invasion using overwhelming force. The death of Llywelyn in December 1282, killed in a skirmish near Builth Wells, effectively ended Welsh independence. Dafydd's capture and execution in 1283, hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor, demonstrated Edward's ruthlessness toward those who challenged his authority. Edward's settlement of Wales was revolutionary in its thoroughness. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 imposed English law and administration on Wales, dividing it into shires on the English model. More dramatically, Edward initiated the construction of a series of castles that represented the pinnacle of medieval military architecture. Caernarfon, Conway, Harlech and Beaumaris were not just fortresses, but symbols of English domination, their massive walls and towers proclaiming the permanence of conquest. The design of these castles, created by Master James of St. George, the greatest military architect of the age, incorporated every advancement in defensive technology. Concentric walls, multiple gatehouses and sophisticated angles of fire made them virtually impregnable. The town walls attached to several castles created fortified English settlements in the heart of Wales, colonial enterprises that would maintain English control for centuries. The cost was enormous, perhaps £80,000 over 2 decades, equivalent to several years of royal revenue. Edward's appointment of his son Edward as Prince of Wales in 1301 created a precedent that continues today. The ceremony at Caernarfon Castle, with its deliberate evocation of Welsh tradition within an English imperial framework, demonstrated Edward's genius for political symbolism. By giving his heir the title of the conquered Welsh princes, he simultaneously honoured and subsumed Welsh identity within English monarchy. The expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290 was one of Edward's most consequential and morally troubling acts. The Jewish community, which had been in England since the Norman Conquest, had been systematically impoverished by royal extortion throughout the 13th century. Edward's expulsion edict, justified by religious prejudice and financial calculation, forced approximately 3,000 Jews to leave England with only what they could carry. Many died in exile, and England lost a commercially sophisticated population that had contributed significantly to economic development. Edward's Scottish interventions began with legal arbitration, but evolved into attempted conquest. The death of Alexander III of Scotland in 1286 and his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290, left the Scottish throne disputed between multiple claimants. Edward was invited to arbitrate between the competitors, primarily John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Elder. Edward's decision in favour of Balliol in 1292 was legally sound, but came with the price of acknowledging Edward as Scotland's feudal overlord. The relationship between Edward and Scotland deteriorated rapidly. Edward's treatment of Balliol as a subordinate vassal rather than a fellow king humiliated Scottish pride. When Balliol allied with France in 1295, Edward had his excuse for invasion. The campaign of 1296 was devastating in its efficiency. Berwick, Scotland's greatest commercial city, was sacked with tremendous slaughter. The Scottish army was destroyed at Dunbar, and Balliol was forced to abdicate, earning the contemptuous nickname Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat. Edward's attempt to incorporate Scotland directly into his realm, removing the Stone of Destiny from Scone and bringing it to Westminster, provoked fierce resistance. William Wallace's rebellion, beginning in 1297, demonstrated that Scotland could not be subdued as easily as Wales. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge in September 1297, where Scottish schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen, defeated English heavy cavalry, shocked Edward and inspired Scottish resistance. Edward's response was characteristically thorough and brutal. The campaign of 1298 saw him personally lead the largest English army assembled in decades. At the Battle of Falkirk on July 22nd, Edward's tactical flexibility defeated Wallace's schiltrons through combined use of longbowmen and cavalry. The longbow, which would become the dominant English weapon for the next 2 centuries, proved its worth by breaking up the Scottish formations before the cavalry charged. Yet military victory didn't translate into political control. Wallace continued guerrilla warfare until his capture and execution in 1305, but new leaders emerged, particularly Robert Bruce the Younger, grandson of the earlier claimant. Bruce's coronation as King of Scots in 1306 represented a direct challenge to Edward's authority that the ageing king could not ignore. Edward's final campaign against Scotland in 1307 showed a king whose body was failing but whose will remained iron. He died at Bure by Sands on July 7, 1307, within sight of Scotland, allegedly ordering that his bones be carried with future armies until Scotland was conquered. This macabre request, never fulfilled, symbolised the obsessive determination that characterised his entire reign. Edward's domestic policies were as significant as his conquests. His relationship with Parliament evolved from tool of royal policy to necessary partner in governance. The model Parliament of 1295 included representatives from shires, towns and clergy, establishing the principle that taxation required consent from those taxed. Edward's famous declaration, "What touches all should be approved by all," though intended to justify his policies, articulated a principle that would eventually limit royal power. The financial demands of constant warfare forced Edward into increasingly difficult negotiations with Parliament. The crisis of 1297, when barons and clergy united to resist taxation for Edward's French wars, nearly led to civil war. The Confirmatio Cartarum, Edward's reconfirmation of Magna Carta and other liberties, represented a significant concession that established parliamentary consent as necessary for extraordinary taxation. Edward's legal legacy extended beyond England. His justiciars created a body of case law that elaborated and refined statutory provisions. The yearbooks, systematic records of legal proceedings, began during his reign, creating precedents that would guide English law for centuries. The emergence of a professional legal class trained at the Inns of Court in London created an institutional framework for law that existed independent of royal will. Edward of Caernarfon, who became Edward II on July 7, 1307, inherited a throne that seemed secure and a realm that his father had expanded and consolidated. Yet within 20 years he would become the first English king since the Conquest to be deposed. His reign a catastrophic failure that nearly destroyed the Plantagenet dynasty. The contrast between father and son could hardly have been more complete, as if nature had played a cruel joke in producing such different men in successive generations. Physically, Edward II was impressive enough, inheriting his father's height and strong build. Contemporary chronicles described him as handsome, with curling blonde hair and a well-proportioned physique that should have commanded respect. Yet there was something lacking in his bearing, an absence of the natural authority that had radiated from his father. Where Edward I had dominated through sheer presence, Edward II seemed almost apologetic about his royalty, uncomfortable with the ceremonial aspects of kingship that were essential to medieval rule. His interests and pleasures set him apart from the martial nobility he was supposed to lead. Edward enjoyed swimming, rowing, and digging ditches, activities considered beneath royal dignity. He liked working with his hands, practicing crafts like thatching and blacksmithing that were associated with common labourers. His love of theatre and minstrelsy, while not unusual for nobility, became excessive in the eyes of contemporaries who expected their king to focus on war and governance. Most controversially, Edward's emotional life was dominated by intense relationships with male favourites that went beyond normal medieval friendship. The nature of these relationships has been debated by historians, but contemporaries had no doubt that they were sexual and inappropriate. In an age when sodomy was considered among the gravest sins, the perception that their king was engaging in such behaviour undermined royal authority in fundamental ways. Piers Gaveston, the first and most notorious of Edward's favourites, had been part of the prince's household since 1300. The son of a Gascon knight, Gaveston was everything Edward was not. Athletic, witty, accomplished in arms, and supremely self-confident. Edward's infatuation with Gaveston was obvious and embarrassing. When Edward I learned of the relationship, he banished Gaveston and allegedly seized his son by the hair, shouting, "Why do you give lands and honours to this nobody?" Edward II's first act as king was to recall Gaveston from exile, immediately signalling that his reign would be different from his father's. Within weeks, Gaveston was made Earl of Cornwall, a title normally reserved for royalty. At Edward's coronation in February 1308, Gaveston carried the crown of St. Edward, the highest honour in the ceremony, and was given precedence over established nobles who had served the crown for generations. The coronation feast became a disaster when it became clear that Edward was more interested in sitting with Gaveston than with his new queen, Isabella of France. The 12-year-old Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France and already renowned for her beauty, was publicly humiliated as her husband lavished attention on his favourite. The French delegation was outraged, and Isabella's uncles returned to France with reports that would poison Anglo-French relations. Gaveston's behaviour made a bad situation worse. He delighted in mocking the established nobility with cruel nicknames. The Earl of Lancaster was the Fiddler, the Earl of Pembroke, Joseph the Jew, and the Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog of Arden. His skill at tournaments, where he repeatedly defeated earls and barons, added injury to insult. The nobility's hatred for Gaveston became murderous, but Edward seemed oblivious to the danger. The ordinances of 1311, forced upon Edward by baronial pressure, represented an attempt to control both the king and his favourite. These 41 articles went beyond even the provisions of Oxford in limiting royal power. The king couldn't leave the realm, make war, or appoint major officials without baronial consent. Most specifically, Gaveston was to be exiled permanently. Edward agreed under duress, but immediately began working to overturn the ordinances. Gaveston's return from exile in late 1311 precipitated civil war. The Earl of Lancaster, Edward's cousin and the most powerful magnate in England, led the opposition. When Gaveston was captured at Scarborough Castle in May 1312, he was promised safe conduct for negotiations. Instead, the Earl of Warwick seized him, and after a mock trial, Gaveston was beheaded on Blacklow Hill on June 19th. His body was left on the ground for days before being recovered by Dominican friars. Edward's grief at Gaveston's death was profound and lasting. He vowed vengeance on the killers, particularly Warwick and Lancaster, creating vendettas that would poison the remainder of his reign. Yet he was forced to pardon the murderers in 1313, lacking the military strength to punish them. This demonstration of royal weakness encouraged further opposition and contempt. The disaster at Bannockburn on June 24th, 1314, destroyed what remained of Edward's military credibility. Leading the largest English army assembled since his father's time, Edward marched to relieve Stirling Castle, the last major English stronghold in Scotland. Robert Bruce, now firmly established as King of Scots, chose his ground carefully, forcing the English to fight on marshy terrain that neutralised their cavalry advantage. The battle was a catastrophic defeat. The English cavalry charges broke against the Scottish schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen that Edward's father had known how to defeat, but Edward II did not. When the English line broke, Edward fled the field, abandoning his army to slaughter. Thousands died, including many nobles, and the ransom demands for captured lords impoverished English nobility for years. Scotland's independence was effectively secured, though not formally recognised. Edward's response to military defeat was to find new favourites. The Despenser family, father and son, both named Hugh, became dominant after 1318. Hugh Despenser the Younger was, like Gaveston, young, handsome, and probably Edward's lover. But unlike Gaveston, he was also intelligent, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. The Despensers used royal favour to build a territorial empire in Wales and the Marches, dispossessing established families through legal chicanery and outright force. Queen Isabella's position became increasingly intolerable. Initially, she tried to work with Edward, bearing him 4 children, including the future Edward III. But the Despensers systematically humiliated her, reducing her income, dismissing her servants, and treating her as an enemy. When war with France erupted in 1324, Edward confiscated Isabella's lands because she was French, the final insult to a woman who had endured decades of neglect. The baronial opposition to the Despensers led to another civil war in 1321-22. The Marcher lords, whose Welsh territories were being seized by the Despensers, allied with Lancaster in rebellion. Initially successful, the rebels were defeated at the Battle of Boroughbridge in March 1322. Lancaster was captured and executed, beheaded outside his own castle of Pontefract in a deliberate echo of Gaveston's death. Edward's victory at Boroughbridge proved Pyrrhic. The executions and imprisonments that followed created new enemies while solving nothing. The Despenser regime became increasingly tyrannical, using torture and judicial murder to maintain power. The Tower of London filled with political prisoners, while the Despensers accumulated wealth through extortion and theft. Edward himself seemed content to let the Despensers rule, while he pursued his hobbies and pleasures. Isabella's mission to France in 1325 to negotiate peace became the catalyst for Edward's downfall. Once in France, she refused to return, declaring that she feared for her life from the Despensers. She began an affair with Roger Mortimer, an exiled Marcher lord who had escaped from the Tower, and together they planned invasion. Isabella and Mortimer gathered a small force of mercenaries, presenting themselves as liberators coming to free England from the Despenser tyranny. The invasion in September 1326 met virtually no resistance. Edward's regime collapsed like a house of cards as nobles, clergy and commons united in welcoming Isabella. London rose in rebellion, lynching Edward's treasurer and any supporter of the regime they could find. Edward fled westward, with the Despensers, but there was nowhere to go. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured at Bristol and immediately executed. Edward and Hugh the Younger were taken in Wales in November. Hugh Despenser, the Younger's execution at Hereford on November 24th, was deliberately brutal. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, with his genitals cut off and burned before his eyes, a specific punishment for sodomy and treason. Edward was forced to watch his favourite's agony, a psychological torture that broke whatever remained of his spirit. The king, who had once worn the crown of the Confessor, was now a prisoner of his own wife and her lover. The deposition of Edward II presented unprecedented constitutional problems. No English king had been formally deposed since the Conquest, and the legal mechanisms didn't exist. Parliament was summoned in Edward's name for January 1327, though he was imprisoned and unable to attend. A series of articles were presented accusing Edward of incompetence, tyranny, and various crimes. When a delegation informed Edward that he must abdicate or see his son disinherited, he collapsed in tears but agreed to surrender the crown. Edward's imprisonment at Berkeley Castle under the custody of Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers was initially comfortable. But the presence of a living ex-king was dangerous for the new regime. Rescue attempts were made, and rumours circulated that Edward's supporters were gathering strength. On September 21st, 1327, Edward died at Berkeley under mysterious circumstances. The official account claimed natural causes, but contemporaries believed he was murdered. The most infamous account, recorded by chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, claimed Edward was killed by having a red-hot poker thrust into his anus, a death that combined execution with symbolic punishment for sodomy. Whether this grotesque story is true or propaganda, Edward's death was almost certainly murder. His body was displayed at Gloucester Cathedral to prove he was dead, then buried with surprising honour. Isabella, perhaps feeling guilty, arranged a magnificent tomb with an alabaster effigy that still survives. Edward III's accession, at age 14 in January 1327, began under the shadow of his mother's lover. Roger Mortimer, now Earl of March, ruled England as de facto regent, while Isabella maintained the fiction that she governed for her son. The young king, tall and golden-haired like his Plantagenet ancestors rather than his failed father, watched and learned while Mortimer accumulated power and enemies. For 3 years Edward bided his time, displaying a patience and cunning that would characterise his long reign. The coup that ended Mortimer's regime in October 1330 demonstrated Edward's capacity for decisive action. Using a secret passage into Nottingham Castle, Edward and a small group of trusted companions burst into Mortimer's chamber, overwhelming his guards. Isabella's pleas to have pity on gentle Mortimer went unheeded. Mortimer was dragged to London, tried for treason, and hanged at Tyburn like a common criminal. Isabella was allowed to retire to comfortable imprisonment, living another 28 years in various royal castles. A reminder of the dangers of female power in medieval politics. Edward's personal rule began with a conscious effort to restore royal prestige after the disasters of his father's reign. He understood that medieval kingship was as much about performance as policy, requiring a king to embody the martial and chivalric values of his nobility. Edward excelled at this performance, combining genuine military skill with a talent for pageantry that made him the model of medieval kingship for centuries to come. Physically, Edward was everything his father had not been. Contemporary descriptions emphasise his commanding presence, with broad shoulders, strong features, and eyes that could be either warmly generous or coldly terrifying, depending on his mood. He dressed magnificently, understanding that royal splendour was not vanity, but necessary display. His court became the most brilliant in Europe, attracting artists, musicians, and writers who celebrated Plantagenet glory. Edward's marriage to Philip of Hainault in January 1328 proved both politically advantageous and personally happy. Philippa, described as tall, brown-skinned and cheerful, bore Edward 14 children who survived infancy. Unlike many royal marriages, theirs seems to have been genuinely affectionate. Philippa accompanied Edward on campaigns, most famously interceding for the burghers of Calais, and her death in 1369 left Edward genuinely bereft. The early years of Edward's reign focused on Scotland, attempting to reverse the humiliation of Bannockburn and complete his grandfather's conquest. Edward Balliol, son of the deposed King John, provided a convenient puppet through whom Edward could claim overlordship. The campaign of 1333 saw Edward demonstrate the tactical innovation that would make English armies dominant for the next century. At Halidon Hill on July 19th, he deployed dismounted men-at-arms, supported by longbowmen in prepared positions, devastating the attacking Scots. But Scotland proved impossible to hold. The young David II, Robert Bruce's son, found refuge in France, while Scottish resistance continued through guerrilla warfare. The costs of occupation exceeded any benefits, and Scottish independence became linked to French support, creating the old alliance that would complicate English foreign policy for centuries. By 1337, Edward was looking for greater prizes than the poor and rebellious kingdom of Scotland. The 100 Years' War, beginning in 1337, transformed Edward from successful king to legendary monarch. His claim to the French throne through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, was legally plausible but politically opportunistic. The succession of Philip VI through the male line only could be challenged, and Edward's assertion of his rights provided justification for what was essentially a war of conquest and plunder. The early campaigns demonstrated English military superiority through tactical innovation. The combination of dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen perfected in Scotland proved devastating against French cavalry charges. The longbow, capable of penetrating armour at 200 yards and fired at rates of 12 arrows per minute, gave English armies a decisive advantage when properly deployed. Edward understood that battles were won by discipline and preparation, not just courage. The naval victory at Slees on June 24, 1340, established English control of the Channel and demonstrated Edward's strategic vision. The French fleet, chained together in defensive formation, was annihilated by English arrows and boarding parties. Edward personally led the assault, fighting hand-to-hand on the French flagship. The victory secured English communications with the continent and prevented French raids on England, essential prerequisites for sustained continental campaigns. The Crusade campaign of 1346 showcased Edward's military genius at its peak. Landing in Normandy with perhaps 15,000 men, he conducted a devastating chevauchée, mounted raid, through northern France, demonstrating French inability to protect their own territory. The Battle of Crécy on August 26th was Edward's masterpiece. Outnumbered perhaps 3-1, he chose his ground carefully, deploying his army on a slope with protected flanks. The French attacks at Crécy came in waves of undisciplined cavalry charges, each one broken by English arrows before reaching the dismounted men-at-arms. The blind King John of Bohemia, tied to his horse and led by his knights, died in a futile charge that epitomized chivalric courage without tactical sense. Philip VI fled the field, leaving thousands of French nobles dead, including the flower of French chivalry. The victory shocked Europe, demonstrating that disciplined commoners with longbows could defeat the mounted aristocracy that had dominated warfare for centuries. The siege of Calais, lasting from September 1346 to August 1347, showed Edward's determination and resources. Calais, the strongest port in northern France, was systematically blockaded by land and sea. Edward built a complete wooden town for his besieging army, demonstrating that he would wait as long as necessary. When the starving city finally surrendered, Edward's initial intention to massacre the inhabitants was prevented by Queen Philippa's famous intercession, though he still expelled the French population and colonised Calais with English settlers. The Black Death, reaching England in 1348, temporarily halted Edward's French ambitions while transforming English society. Perhaps a third of England's population died, creating labour shortages that undermined feudal structures. Edward's government responded with the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but economic forces proved stronger than royal decree. The plague's demographic catastrophe paradoxically strengthened England's military position by creating a more militarised society where commoners could rise through military service. The Battle of Poitiers on September 19th, 1356, though commanded by Edward's son, the Black Prince, rather than the king himself, represented the apex of English military achievements. The Black Prince, outnumbered and cornered by a larger French army, won a victory even more complete than Crécy. King John II of France was captured along with much of the French nobility, allowing Edward to demand enormous ransoms that financed his government for years. Edward's treatment of the captive French king demonstrated his understanding of chivalric politics. John was housed in comfortable captivity, allowed to maintain his royal dignity while negotiating his ransom. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which granted Edward full sovereignty over vast French territories in exchange for renouncing his claim to the French throne, seemed to achieve everything Edward had fought for, though its implementation would prove impossible. The Order of the Garter, founded by Edward around 1348, embodied his vision of chivalric kingship. Limited to 26 knights, including the king, it created an elite brotherhood dedicated to martial prowess and loyalty. The order's motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, allegedly originated when Edward retrieved a lady's fallen garter at a dance, transforming potential embarrassment into chivalric triumph. The order became Europe's most prestigious chivalric institution, membership coveted by princes and warriors across Christendom. Edward's patronage of arts and architecture rivalled his military achievements. Windsor Castle was transformed from Norman fortress to Gothic palace, with the magnificent St. George's Hall serving as the Garter's chapel. Edward spent over £50,000 on Windsor, creating an architectural statement of Plantagenet power. His court attracted Geoffrey Chaucer, whose poetry celebrated and sometimes satirised the chivalric culture Edward promoted. The later years of Edward's reign saw declining fortune and personal tragedy. The resumption of war in 1369 went badly, with English territories in France gradually lost to French reconquest under Charles V. The Black Prince, Edward's heir and greatest general, contracted dysentery while campaigning in Spain and never recovered, dying in 1376. Queen Philippa's death in 1369 removed a moderating influence, and Edward fell under the influence of Alice Perez, his mistress, whose greed and corruption scandalised the court. The Good Parliament of 1376, the longest parliament yet held, demonstrated growing constitutional assertiveness. The Commons, led by Pate de la Mare as the first recognised speaker, impeached several of Edward's ministers and even attempted to remove Alice Perez from court. Though Edward reversed these actions after Parliament dissolved, the precedent of parliamentary impeachment was established, another step in the long evolution of constitutional monarchy. Edward's death on June 21, 1377, at Sheen Palace came as his grandson, Richard, son of the Black Prince, knelt beside his bed. The old king, who had reigned for 50 years and transformed England into Europe's premier military power, died abandoned by courtiers who stripped rings from his fingers before his body was cold. Yet his legacy endured. He had made England a major European power, established English as the language of government, and created the chivalric culture that would define aristocratic values for centuries. Richard of Bordeaux became King Richard II at age 10, inheriting a realm that his grandfather had made glorious but that was now facing unprecedented challenges. The boy who was crowned at Westminster on July 16th, 1377, seemed to embody royal dignity despite his youth. Tall for his age, with golden hair and delicate features that reminded observers of his father, the Black Prince, Richard sat through the lengthy coronation ceremony with remarkable composure, though he had to be carried from the abbey afterward, exhausted by the weight of ceremonial robes and crown. The minority government that ruled in Richard's name faced immediate crises. The war in France was going disastrously, consuming resources while yielding no victories. The social upheaval caused by the Black Death had created tensions between landlords demanding traditional services and peasants aware of their new economic power. The church was divided by the Great Schism, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon. These structural problems required strong leadership, but Richard was a child, and his uncles were more interested in their own power than good governance. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster and Richard's eldest surviving uncle, dominated the early years of the reign. Gaunt was immensely wealthy, controlling the Duchy of Lancaster with estates throughout England, and maintained a household that rivalled the royal court. His ambitions extended beyond England. He claimed the throne of Castile through his wife, and spent enormous resources pursuing Spanish adventures. Many suspected he coveted his nephew's throne, though Gaunt consistently demonstrated loyalty to Richard personally while opposing his policies. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 provided the first great crisis of Richard's reign, and his first moment of personal triumph. The rebellion began in Essex and Kent, triggered by a poll tax that fell heavily on the poor. Under leaders like Wat Tyler and John Ball, who preached radical equality with the rhyme, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" the rebels marched on London, burning manor houses and killing lawyers and government officials. The 14-year-old Richard showed remarkable courage during the revolt. When the rebels occupied London and murdered his chancellor, Archbishop Sudbury, Richard agreed to meet them at Mile End. He made extensive concessions, agreeing to abolish serfdom and fix rents at reasonable levels. The next day at Smithfield, when Wat Tyler was struck down during negotiations by Mayor William Woolworth, Richard rode forward alone toward the confused rebel army, declaring, "I am your captain, follow me," and led them out of London. This moment of teenage bravery became legendary, though Richard immediately revoked all concessions once the danger passed, allegedly declaring, "Villains ye are, and villains ye shall remain." This early display of personal courage, combined with duplicity, would characterize Richard's entire reign. He possessed undeniable physical bravery and a keen sense of royal dignity, but also a tendency toward deception and vindictiveness that would ultimately destroy him. The suppression of the revolt, with perhaps 1,500 executions, taught Richard that royal power could crush opposition if wielded ruthlessly, a lesson he would apply with increasing frequency. Richard's marriage to Anne of Bohemia in January 1382 brought him personal happiness, but little political advantage. Anne, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles IV brought no dowry and few allies, but Richard genuinely loved her. Their marriage was childless but affectionate, with Anne exercising a moderating influence on Richard's increasingly autocratic tendencies. Her death in 1394 would remove one of the few restraints on his behaviour. The young king's court developed a sophisticated culture that contrasted sharply with his grandfather's martial ethos. Richard patronised artists, poets, and musicians, creating a court where refinement and ceremony were valued over military prowess. Geoffrey Chaucer received royal patronage, while illuminated manuscripts and panel paintings flourished. Richard himself was painted in the Wilton diptych, a portable altarpiece showing him being presented to the Virgin Mary, one of the finest surviving examples of medieval royal portraiture. Richard's conception of kingship was revolutionary for England. He believed in divine right, seeing himself as God's anointed whose will was law. He introduced new forms of address requiring subjects to call him Your Majesty rather than the traditional My Lord King. He commissioned a throne of extraordinary magnificence and would sit upon it for hours in silence, requiring anyone who caught his eye to kneel. This theatrical kingship, influenced by French models, alienated the English nobility, who expected their king to be first among equals, not a distant divinity. The conflict with the Lords Appellant in 1387–88 nearly ended Richard's reign before he reached adulthood. 5 powerful nobles, the Duke of Gloucester, Richard's uncle, the Earls of Arundel, Warwick, Nottingham, and Derby, John of Gaunt's son, later Henry IV, accused Richard's favourites of treason. The king's attempts to resist led to military defeat at Radcot Bridge in December 1387, where his royal army was scattered by the appellant's forces. The merciless Parliament of 1388 saw the appellants effectively ruling England, while Richard was reduced to a powerless figurehead. Richard's friends and advisers were executed or exiled in judicial murders that traumatised the young king. Sir Simon Burley, Richard's beloved tutor, was beheaded despite Queen Anne falling to her knees before the appellants to beg for his life. Richard watched these proceedings in silence, memorising every humiliation, planning revenge that would come a decade later. For several years after the merciless Parliament, Richard appeared to accept constitutional constraints on his power. He worked with moderate nobles governed through established institutions and seemed to have learned from his early mistakes. This period, from 1389 to 1397, saw effective governance and relative prosperity. Richard even achieved a 28-year truce with France in 1396, his greatest diplomatic success. But Richard was dissembling, biding his time while carefully building his power. He created a private army of Cheshire archers who wore his White Hart badge and acted as political police. He cultivated the bishops, appointing loyalists to key positions. He built up a substantial treasury through efficient administration and avoided expensive foreign wars. Most importantly, he waited for his enemies to grow complacent and divide among themselves. Richard's second marriage to Isabella of Valois, the 6-year-old daughter of Charles VI of France, in 1396, was purely political, but demonstrated his diplomatic sophistication. The marriage sealed the French truce and brought a substantial dowry, while the bride's youth meant Richard wouldn't face pressure to produce an heir immediately. He treated the child queen with kindness, creating an elaborate household for her education and entertainment. The revenge Richard took in 1397 shocked even those who knew his vindictive nature. Without warning, he arrested the Duke of Gloucester, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Warwick. Gloucester was sent to Calais, where he was murdered, probably smothered on Richard's orders. Arundel was subjected to a show trial and beheaded, with Richard allegedly telling him, "You shall have the same mercy you showed Simon Burley." Warwick, who grovelled and confessed, was imprisoned for life. The Parliament of 1397–98 held at Shrewsbury and carefully packed with Richard's supporters, marked the beginning of what historians call Richard's tyranny. He forced through legislation that made it treason to attempt to reverse the acts of this Parliament. He required 17 counties to seal blank charters, giving him power to impose whatever penalties he chose for any perceived disloyalty. He forced loans from wealthy subjects and imposed arbitrary fines for decades-old offences. The quarrel between Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt's son, now Duke of Hereford, and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, provided Richard with an opportunity to eliminate 2 more potential threats. When the 2 dukes accused each other of treason, Richard arranged a trial by combat at Coventry in September 1398. But at the last moment, as the combatants were about to engage, Richard dramatically intervened, banishing Mowbray for life and Bolingbroke for 10 years, later reduced to 6. John of Gaunt's death in February 1399 triggered the crisis that would end Richard's reign. Instead of allowing Henry Bolingbroke to inherit the vast Duchy of Lancaster, Richard extended his exile to life and seized the Lancastrian estates. This violation of inheritance rights terrified every property owner in England. If the king could arbitrarily seize the greatest duchy in England, no one's lands were safe. Richard's decision to campaign in Ireland in 1399 was strategically sound, but politically catastrophic. Ireland required royal attention, and Richard's expedition was well planned and initially successful. But his absence from England allowed Henry Bolingbroke to return from exile, landing at Ravenspur in Yorkshire in July 1399. Henry claimed he came only to recover his inheritance, but his actions suggested larger ambitions from the beginning. The speed of Richard's collapse was stunning. The nobility, alienated by years of arbitrary rule, flocked to Henry's banner. The Cheshire archers, Richard's supposed guarantee of power, melted away without their king to lead them. By the time Richard returned from Ireland in late July, Henry controlled most of England. Richard's attempt to raise forces in Wales failed when his remaining supporters, including his cousin the Duke of Aumale, defected to Henry. The meeting between Richard and Henry at Flint Castle in August 1399 was carefully choreographed to humiliate the king while maintaining the fiction that Henry sought only his duchy. Richard was forced to travel to London as effectively Henry's prisoner, though still nominally king. The crowds that had once knelt at Richard's glance now jeered and threw rubbish at him. At one point, Richard allegedly said he wished he could die, to which Henry coldly replied that he would help Richard to Parliament to answer for his crimes. Richard's deposition in September 1399 created a constitutional crisis. No undisputed English king had been formally deposed, and the legal mechanisms were unclear. Parliament was summoned in Richard's name, though he was imprisoned in the Tower. A list of 33 articles was presented, accusing Richard of everything from murder to incompetence. When a delegation informed Richard he must abdicate, he allegedly replied that he could not renounce the sacred chrism of coronation, but would willingly surrender the crown to his cousin Henry. The abdication scene, later dramatised by Shakespeare, was high political theatre. Richard appeared before Parliament, still dressed in royal robes, and personally handed the crown and sceptre to Henry. He then launched into a lengthy speech comparing himself to Christ betrayed by Judas, forcing his deposers to confront the sacrilege of overthrowing God's anointed. This performance, simultaneously pathetic and magnificent, demonstrated Richard's understanding that even in defeat, he could shape how history would remember him. Henry's accession as Henry IV was legally dubious, justified by a fictional claim that Edmund Crouchback, ancestor of the Lancastrians, had been the elder brother of Edward I. This lie fooled no one, and Henry's real claim was conquest and parliamentary approval. The dangerous precedent was set. Parliament could make and unmake kings, a principle that would fuel the Wars of the Roses and ultimately the English Civil War. Richard's imprisonment at Pontefract Castle was initially comfortable, but his continued existence posed an insurmountable problem for Henry. Plots to restore Richard emerged immediately, including the Epiphany Rising of January 1400. Though this rebellion was quickly suppressed, it demonstrated that while Richard lived, Henry's throne would never be secure. In February 1400, Richard died at Pontefract under mysterious circumstances. The official account claimed Richard starved himself to death in despair, but few believed this story. More likely, he was murdered on Henry's orders, though the exact method remains unknown. One chronicle claims he was hacked to death with axes while bravely defending himself. Another, that he was starved to death over weeks. His body was displayed in London to prove he was dead, though his face was covered, fueling rumours that he had escaped and would return. Richard's body was initially buried without ceremony at King's Langley, but Henry V, in an act of reconciliation, had him reinterred at Westminster Abbey in 1413, in the magnificent tomb Richard had commissioned for himself and Queen Anne. This belated honour recognised what Richard had always insisted, that despite his failures and crimes, he had been true King of England, anointed by God, and his overthrow was an offence against divine order. The Plantagenet dynasty formally ended with Richard II's deposition in 1399, though Plantagenet blood would continue to flow through the houses of Lancaster and York, themselves cadet branches of the great family tree planted by Geoffrey of Anjou. The 3 centuries of Plantagenet rule had transformed England from a conquered province of a Norman French empire into a unified kingdom with its own distinct identity, language, and institutions that would shape not just Britain, but much of the world through later British imperial expansion. The legal legacy of the Plantagenets proved their most enduring contribution to human civilization. Henry II's creation of common law, a systematic legal framework administered by professional judges according to established procedures, became the foundation for legal systems throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. The principle that law should be predictable, accessible, and superior to arbitrary power, though often violated by the Plantagenets themselves, took root during their reigns and would eventually flower into modern concepts of rule of law. The development of Parliament under the Plantagenets, though never their intention, created the prototype for representative government that would spread across the globe. What began as a tool for royal administration, a means for kings to extract taxation and legitimise their policies, evolved into an institution that could limit monarchical power and eventually claim sovereignty itself. Simon de Montfort's inclusion of burgesses and knights in his parliament of 1265, Edward I's model parliament, even the parliamentary depositions of Edward II and Richard II, all contributed to the slow emergence of constitutional monarchy. Magna Carta, that document reluctantly sealed by John at Runnymede, became through historical accident and creative reinterpretation a foundation stone of liberty. Though originally intended merely to protect baronial privileges, its principles were gradually extended and reimagined. The idea that government power should be limited by law, that there should be due process before punishment, that taxation requires consent, these concepts, however imperfectly realised under the Plantagenets, would inspire revolutionaries and reformers centuries later. The English language itself owes much to the Plantagenet era. When they began their rule, English was the despised tongue of conquered peasants, with French the language of court and Latin the language of learning. By Richard II's reign, English had emerged as a literary language capable of producing Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and Richard himself was the first king since the Conquest to speak English as his primary language. This linguistic transformation, driven by the loss of French territories and the need to communicate with English subjects, created the foundation for English's eventual emergence as a global language. The architectural legacy of the Plantagenets remains visible throughout Britain. The great castles of Wales, Edward I's iron ring of stone, still dominate the landscape. Westminster Abbey, rebuilt by Henry III, remains the coronation church and royal mausoleum. Countless parish churches with their pointed arches and decorated windows testify to the Gothic revolution that occurred during Plantagenet rule. These buildings were not mere structures but statements of power, faith, and artistic vision that continue to inspire and awe. The Plantagenets' contribution to military innovation reshaped European warfare. The tactical combination of dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen, perfected during the Scottish and French wars, demonstrated that disciplined infantry could defeat aristocratic cavalry, beginning the long decline of mounted knights as the dominant force in warfare. The development of gunpowder weapons during the later Plantagenet period, though primitive, pointed toward future revolutions in military technology. The concept of chivalry, though not invented by the Plantagenets, was refined and codified during their reigns into a cultural force that shaped European aristocratic values for centuries. Edward III's Order of the Garter created a model for chivalric orders throughout Europe. The ideals of knightly behaviour, courage, courtesy, protection of the weak, loyalty to one's lord, however often violated in practice, provided a civilizing influence on warrior aristocracy and contributed to later concepts of gentlemanly behaviour and military honour. The Plantagenet era saw the emergence of England as a maritime power. Richard I's fleet for the Third Crusade, Edward III's naval victory at Slees, the development of Portsmouth and other naval bases all laid foundations for England's later dominance of the seas. The loss of continental territories forced England to look to the sea for security and eventually for empire, a reorientation that would have profound historical consequences. The economic transformations of the Plantagenet centuries were equally significant. The growth of London from a modest town to one of Europe's great cities, the development of the wool trade that funded Edward III's wars, the emergence of banking and credit mechanisms to support royal finances, all contributed to England's eventual emergence as a commercial and industrial power. The Black Death, though devastating, broke feudal structures and created labour markets that would eventually contribute to capitalist development. The Plantagenet dynasty's internal conflicts, particularly the depositions of Edward II and Richard II, established precedents that would haunt English monarchy for centuries. The idea that a king could be judged unfit to rule, that the crown could be transferred outside normal hereditary succession, created instabilities that would manifest in the Wars of the Roses and ultimately the English Civil War. Yet these conflicts also contributed to the development of limited monarchy and constitutional government. The cultural flowering under the Plantagenets laid foundations for the English Renaissance. The court poetry of Richard II's reign, the historical chronicles that recorded and mythologized Plantagenet deeds, the musical innovations of the Ars Nova, all contributed to a distinctly English cultural tradition. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge, though predating the Plantagenets, developed during their reign into major intellectual centres that would shape English and world thought. The Plantagenet relationship with the Church, tumultuous and complex, contributed to England's distinctive religious development. The murder of Thomas Becket, the struggles over church jurisdiction, the eventual English submission to and then rejection of papal authority, all foreshadowed the English Reformation. The anti-clericalism that developed during disputes over church wealth and privilege would eventually contribute to Protestant Reformation. The concept of English nationalism, though anachronistic for the medieval period, began to emerge during the Plantagenet centuries. The wars with Scotland and France created a sense of English identity distinct from both Celtic neighbours and continental connections. The loss of French territories, traumatic at the time, forced the English monarchy and nobility to become truly English rather than French aristocrats who happened to rule England. The Plantagenet legacy in Ireland and Wales remains controversial and painful. Edward I's conquest of Wales and attempted conquest of Scotland. The Plantagenet colonisation of Ireland established patterns of English domination that would persist for centuries with profound and often tragic consequences. The castles that tourists admire were instruments of conquest and oppression, the administrative structures tools of colonial control. Yet even in conquered territories, Plantagenet influence had complex effects. The introduction of English law, however oppressive its initial application, provided frameworks that would eventually be used to claim rights and resist arbitrary power. The towns established around Plantagenet castles became centres of commerce and culture. The integration of Welsh and Irish aristocracies into English noble structures, though designed to co-opt resistance, created complex hybrid identities that enriched British culture. The artistic representations of the Plantagenets, from medieval chronicles to Shakespeare's history, plays to modern historical fiction, have shaped popular understanding of the medieval period. Richard the Lionheart became the archetypal Crusader king, Prince John the villain of Robin Hood legends, Henry V the patriot king of Agincourt. These cultural representations, however historically inaccurate, have influenced how subsequent generations understood monarchy, nobility, and medieval society. The genealogical legacy of the Plantagenets extends far beyond Britain. Through marriages and descent, Plantagenet blood flowed into royal and noble houses throughout Europe. Every subsequent English and British monarch descended from the Plantagenets, as do many European royal families. This biological legacy, though scientifically meaningless, maintained symbolic importance in establishing legitimacy and continuity. The Plantagenet era coincided with and contributed to broader European transformations. The Renaissance of the 12th century, the rise of universities, the development of scholastic philosophy, the growth of towns and commerce, the emergence of vernacular literatures. England, under the Plantagenets, was not isolated but part of a broader European civilization, contributing to and drawing from continental developments while maintaining distinctive characteristics. The study of the Plantagenets themselves has evolved through centuries of historiography. Medieval chroniclers, often monks writing in monasteries, portrayed them through moral and religious lenses. Tudor historians, seeking to justify their dynasty, painted the Plantagenets as tyrants or incompetents whose overthrow was necessary. Victorian historians, influenced by ideas of progress and nationalism, saw in the Plantagenets the origins of English liberty and greatness. Modern historians, using archaeological evidence, statistical analysis, and interdisciplinary approaches, continue to revise and complicate our understanding of these complex figures. As we look back across the centuries at the Plantagenet dynasty, we see not a simple story of good kings and bad kings, of progress or decline, but a complex human drama that shaped the world we inhabit. These men and women, with their ambitions and failures, their cruelties and kindnesses, their innovations and conservatism, created institutions and precedents that continue to influence human society. They were products of their time, but also shapers of the future, medieval in their worldview, but accidentally modern in some of their creations. The England that Henry II inherited in 1154 was a war-torn province of a cross-channel empire, speaking French and looking to continental Europe for cultural and political models. The England that Henry IV seized in 1399 was a unified kingdom with its own language, laws and nascent parliamentary institutions, forced by the loss of continental territories to develop an insular but distinctive identity. This transformation, achieved through 3 centuries of Plantagenet rule, created the foundations for England's later emergence as a global power. The Plantagenet legacy reminds us that historical change is rarely intentional or predictable. Henry II did not intend to create English common law. He simply wanted more efficient administration and revenue. Simon de Montfort did not intend to create parliamentary democracy. He wanted to control a weak king. The barons at Runnymede did not intend to establish universal human rights. They wanted to protect their own privileges. Yet from these limited and often selfish motivations emerged institutions and principles that would benefit humanity far beyond their creators' imagination. Today, as tourists walk through the ruins of Plantagenet castles, as lawyers argue cases using principles derived from Henry II's legal reforms, as parliaments meet in systems ultimately descended from Plantagenet precedents, as the English language carries Plantagenet words across the globe, the dynasty's influence continues. They are gone, but not forgotten. Their direct rule ended, but their legacy enduring. Those fierce Angevin lords who wore the crown of England, and, through their triumphs and failures, helped create the modern world. The story of the Plantagenets is ultimately a human story, full of passion and violence, ambition and failure, love and hatred. They were not mythical figures, but real people facing real challenges with the tools and understanding available to them. Their successes inspire, their failures instruct, and their struggles remind us that every generation must grapple with the fundamental questions of power, justice, and governance that the Plantagenets faced in their time. From Geoffrey's sprig of yellow broom to Richard's white hart, from Henry II's restless energy to Richard II's tragic fall, the Plantagenets gave England 3 centuries of dramatic, transformative, and ultimately foundational rule. They built and destroyed, conquered and lost, created and inadvertently inspired institutions that would outlive them by centuries. They were kings and queens, princes and princesses, but above all, they were human beings whose lives and choices shaped the course of history. As our story of the Plantagenets comes to its close, we leave them where they rest, in the great abbeys and cathedrals of England and France. Henry II and Richard the Lionheart lie at Fontevraud, Eleanor of Aquitaine between them, the great family that could barely tolerate each other in life united in death. Edward I lies in Westminster Abbey in a plain tomb as he requested, the hammer of the Scots finally still. Richard II rests beside his beloved Anne of Bohemia, their effigies holding hands for eternity, a touching reminder that even kings sought love and companionship. These tombs, visited by millions over the centuries, stand as monuments not just to individual rulers, but to an entire era when England was transformed from conquered territory to conquering nation, from feudal fragmentation to nascent national unity, from the margins of European civilization to a central player in European politics and culture. The Plantagenets did not accomplish this transformation alone, but they presided over it, shaped it, and sometimes inadvertently caused it through their very failures. And so we leave the Plantagenets to history, those restless, ambitious, brilliant, and flawed rulers who wore the English crown for 3 centuries and left a legacy that endures to this day. Their story reminds us that history is made not by abstract forces but by individual human beings making choices, sometimes wise, sometimes foolish, but always consequential. In studying them, we study ourselves for the challenges they faced, how to govern justly, how to balance competing interests, how to use power wisely, remain the challenges of our own time. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the entire story of the Plantagenets. If you enjoyed this exploration of medieval England's most dramatic dynasty, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you won't miss future episodes where we dive deep into history's most fascinating stories. Leave a comment below sharing which Plantagenet monarch you found most interesting and what historical dynasty or era you'd like us to explore next. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how we became who we are today. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be more peaceful than that of the turbulent Plantagenets.